It is late. The house has gone quiet around you, the way a house only goes quiet after a long day of noise, when the machines stop, when the voices stop, when the only sound is the soft press of your own breathing against the pillow. You are still here, still thinking, still turning something over in the back of your mind that you cannot quite name. There is a reason for that. Tonight we sit with Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who spent 60 years asking one question that most of his colleagues refused to touch. What is the mind when you include everything the mind contains? Not just the thoughts you choose, not just the plans, the memories you can access, the opinions you hold in daylight, everything. The dreams that visit you uninvited, the moods that arrive without cause, the images that surface at the edge of sleep and dissolve before you can look at them clearly. Jung believed something radical. He believed that consciousness, the thinking, deciding, reasoning part of you that feels like the self, is only a small fraction of what the mind actually is. A narrow beam. A candle held in a large and mostly dark room. In 1913, in a study in Zurich, he sat alone after the most painful rupture of his professional life, the break with Sigmund Freud, who had been his mentor, his collaborator, the man who had believed in him most. The break was final. The letters stopped. The intellectual partnership that had shaped Jung's early career was over. He was 40 years old. He had just lost his closest colleague. And something stranger was happening. He was beginning to hear voices he could not explain, to see images in waking hours that felt like messages from somewhere he did not yet have a name for. A lesser man would have called it breakdown. Jung called it data. He began writing, painting, carving stone, filling an enormous illuminated manuscript with everything his unconscious was sending him. Images, visions, figures that spoke in languages he barely recognized. He showed it to no one. The manuscript sat in a locked box for decades. He called it the Red Book. What Jung was doing in those years, what he was beginning to understand, was that consciousness is not the master of the house. It is a room in the house. And there are other rooms, deeper rooms, rooms with no windows that the conscious mind never visits, and yet rooms that are fully occupied, that are thinking, feeling, generating images and impulses and beliefs that rise up through the floor and shape the life you live above without your knowing it. This was the idea that disturbed his colleagues. This was the claim that made the more mechanistic psychologists of his era uncomfortable. And this is where we begin tonight. Somewhere beneath the thought you are thinking right now, something larger is at work. Let your body settle into wherever it rests. The ideas will come slowly. Nothing is asked of you tonight except that you listen. So let us begin. Chapter 2: Why Jung Disturbed Psychologists. There is a type of professional discomfort that is not really about disagreement. It is about the feeling that a colleague has opened a door that everyone else agreed, without quite saying so, to keep shut. Carl Jung opened that door. In the early decades of the 20th century, psychology was doing its best to become a science in the way physics was a science. Measurable, repeatable, verifiable. The field was young and anxious to be taken seriously. It wanted clean experiments, observable behavior, mechanisms that could be diagrammed. John Watson, working in Baltimore in 1913, the same year Jung was filling his Red Book, published his famous behaviorist manifesto. The mind, Watson argued, was not a useful subject at all. What mattered was behavior. Stimulus and response, nothing that could not be observed from the outside. Freud had at least kept the interior. He believed in the unconscious. But Freud's unconscious was a specific thing, a storehouse of repressed wishes, mostly sexual, mostly from childhood, that required a skilled analyst to excavate. It was a mechanism. It had rules. It pointed backward. Jung looked at the same unconscious and saw something far stranger. He saw a psyche that was not passive, not just a container for things you had pushed away, a psyche that moved, that had intentions, that compensated, corrected, warned, revealed, that communicated through images and symbols in a language older than spoken words. He saw dreams that were not wish fulfillments, but messages, not from your mother or your childhood or your repressed sexual wishes, but from something in the deeper layers of the mind that had been watching your conscious life and had decided it needed to offer a correction. He saw patterns repeating across cultures separated by oceans and centuries, the great mother, the wise old man, the trickster, the hero, and he did not believe this was coincidence or diffusion. He believed it pointed to something structural, something built into the architecture of the human mind itself. He called these inherited structures archetypes. He called the shared layer where they lived the collective unconscious. And this was where his colleagues got uneasy. The collective unconscious could not be measured. It could not be observed with the tools that Watson and his followers were sharpening. It could not be strictly reproduced in a laboratory. It was inferred from patterns in myths, from the content of psychotic visions, from the dreams of ordinary people who had never read the ancient texts, that their sleeping minds were nonetheless echoing. The psychiatrist Eugen Bleuler, who had been Jung's supervisor at the Burgerholzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich in the early 1900s, was a careful man. He admired Jung's clinical work. He distrusted Jung's later theoretical reaches. And yet Jung continued. He continued because he had seen too much. He had sat with patients whose inner worlds were too rich, too specific, too architecturally strange to be explained by mechanism alone. He had watched people heal not through analysis of the past, but through attention to the symbolic content of the present, through engagement with the images the psyche was producing right now. He had experienced it himself. Those years after the break with Freud, those strange visions and voices, he did not pathologize them. He dialogued with them. He asked what they wanted. He let them speak, and slowly they organized themselves into something coherent, into a theory, into a life's work. What disturbed his colleagues was not that Jung was wrong, it was that he was asking questions their methodology was not equipped to answer. And for a young field trying to prove it belonged in the world of science, that was more threatening than any competing finding. The door he opened is still open. We walk through it tonight. Chapter 3, Consciousness is not the whole mind. Imagine a river. Above the surface, visible in the light, is the layer you can see from the bank. The current moving, leaves floating, the occasional fish breaking the surface. This is what you tend to call your mind. The thoughts moving through awareness, the plans and opinions and memories you can examine. But below that surface, the river is doing something else entirely. There are currents moving in directions you cannot see from the bank. There is weight and depth. There are structures at the bottom that shape the flow of everything above without being visible. Carl Jung spent his life studying what was below the surface. His central claim was deceptively simple. Consciousness is not the whole mind. The part of mental life you have access to, the thinking you think of as thinking, is only a fraction of what the psyche is doing at any given moment. The philosopher William James, writing from Harvard in the 1890s before Jung, had fully developed his own theory called consciousness a stream, something continuous, something you were always inside of. What James noticed, but did not fully theorize, was how much that stream was fed by underground sources. Jung took this further. He said the underground sources were not just larger than the stream, they were older. They operated by different rules. They did not think in propositions. They did not follow logic. They spoke in images, in feelings, in symbolic language that the rational mind could barely translate. He described the conscious mind, what he called the ego, as a complex, a particular organization of mental material that had the distinctive property of feeling like the center of experience. The ego says, I. It has continuity. It remembers yesterday. It makes plans for tomorrow. It decides. But it does not originate. It responds. The thoughts that arrive in your head as you lie here tonight, you did not generate them from scratch. Something generated them and delivered them to consciousness. Something chose which memories to surface, which images to send, which feelings to attach to, which thoughts. That choosing happened below the level of your awareness. This is not mystical. It is simply structural. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio, working out of the University of Southern California decades after Jung, found similar conclusions from a very different direction. He studied patients with damage to specific brain regions, patients whose rational capacities were intact, but who could no longer make decisions. What they lacked was not reasoning. They lacked the somatic signals, the emotional underpinning that told them which option mattered more than another. Without the body's felt sense, reasoning alone could not choose. What the body was doing, what the emotional layers were doing, was providing a substrate that consciousness could not generate on its own. Jung saw this as confirmation of what he had always believed. The ego is dependent on something larger. The mind the ego inhabits is far more than the ego is aware of. There is a comfort in this, if you sit with it long enough. The feeling that you cannot figure something out, the sense that your deliberate thinking keeps circling the same problem without resolution, this is not a failure of intelligence. It may be that the problem is being worked on somewhere below the surface, and what you can do is stop filling the surface with noise long enough for an answer to come up. The philosopher William James drew this point out with unusual clarity in his 1890 Principles of Psychology, a work that Jung read closely and acknowledged as foundational. James described the fringe of consciousness, not just the bright center of attention, but the penumbral awareness that surrounded every conscious moment. The half-noticed, the about-to-be noticed, the never quite noticed. This fringe was not nothing. It was the material from which attention selected. It was the sea from which each conscious moment rose. Jung extended this indefinitely downward. Below James's fringe, the personal unconscious. Below the personal unconscious, the collective unconscious. Each layer older, less personal, less accessible to the ego's deliberate reach. And each layer active, not inert, not merely storage, but participating in the generation of the conscious moment through processes. The conscious moment could not observe. This is difficult to accept because the ego's experience is of originating. The thought appears in the mind and feels like it originated there. The decision is made and feels like it was made freely, from a position of complete self-knowledge. The ego has no experience of its own dependence on the processes below it. It has no experience of being fed. It experiences only what has already been delivered to it, already partly processed, already shaped by structures it did not choose. James had a phrase for what happens when you try to examine this too directly. The thought flies from the feather it would catch. The moment you attempt to catch the thought in the act of arriving, before it has arrived, at the border between the unconscious and the conscious, it retreats. The observation collapses the phenomenon being observed. Jung worked around this through indirect methods, through the dream, which was produced by the unconscious in the relative absence of the ego's corrective influence, through the word association test, which revealed unconscious clusters through the disruptions they caused at the surface, through active imagination, which allowed a controlled loosening of the ego's grip so the unconscious figures could emerge and speak. What all of these methods shared was the recognition that the deeper mind could not be grasped directly. It could only be inferred, engaged, listened to. You could not force it to show itself, but you could create the conditions in which it was more likely to move, more likely to send something up through the floor. Silence is one of those conditions. Stillness is one of those conditions. The hour before sleep, when the defense is thin and the busy mind finally reaches its edge, is one of those conditions. The deeper mind is close right now, closer than it was an hour ago. Let your shoulders drop. The mind does not stop when the thinking stops. Chapter 4, the ego's narrow candle. The candle is perhaps the better image. Not a river, too dynamic, too much movement for what Jung was trying to describe. A candle in a large, mostly dark room. The candle is consciousness, the ego, the I that makes decisions, that reads this sentence, that has a name and a history and a continuous story it tells about itself. The candle is real. The candle provides genuine light. By that light, you navigate the practical world. You work, you make choices, you form relationships, you maintain a coherent enough sense of self to move through time. But the room is large, and most of the room is dark. Not dark because it is empty. Dark because the candle cannot reach it. The darkness is full of furniture, full of patterns and structures and accumulated material that the light of consciousness has never illuminated. And yet, that material is present and exerts weight. Jung described the ego's relationship to the total psyche the way a cork describes its relationship to the ocean. The cork floats on the surface. It moves in response to currents below. It cannot see those currents. It cannot control them. And it would be a mistake for the cork to believe that it generates the waves. This is the ego's fundamental error, Jung believed. The ego assumes it is in charge. It assumes that the thoughts arising in consciousness originate there. It assumes that what feels like a decision is actually a decision, something chosen freely from a position of full awareness. But the unconscious has been preparing that decision for hours or years. The unconscious has been processing, weighing, sorting. By the time the ego becomes aware of a choice, something below has already done most of the work. The conscious deliberation is often, Jung thought, more like ratification than origination. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, writing in Frankfurt decades before Jung was born, described something similar from a philosophical direction. He called it the will, a blind, non-rational force beneath the level of reason that drove human behavior, while reason told a story afterward about why the behavior made sense. Schopenhauer was not a psychologist, but Jung read him deeply, found in him a kindred recognition that the rational surface of mental life is underlaid by something that does not share its values. This recognition is not comfortable for the ego. The ego's job, after all, is to organize, to predict, to feel like it understands what is happening. An ego that suddenly grasps that it is a small candle in a large dark room experiences something uncomfortable, something that, if the recognition goes deep enough, looks a great deal like the specific anxiety Jung spent decades studying. The psychoanalyst Ernest Jones, Freud's biographer, who crossed paths with Jung in the early years before the break, described the ego as the mind's administrator. Administrators are useful, but they mistake their function when they believe they are the organization rather than one function within it. Jung was asking the ego to develop what he called a relationship with the unconscious. Not to surrender, not to be dissolved, but to recognize its actual position, a position of genuine but limited authority within a much larger system. The candle is real. The light it casts is real, but the room is what holds it. The psychologist Otto Rank, who had been a close associate of Freud before his own departure from the Freudian circle, described what he called the artist type as the person who was most acutely aware of this tension between the ego's need for boundaries and the deeper self's pull toward the unbounded. The artist type could not simply adapt to the ego's social requirements. They felt too strongly the pull of something larger. They suffered the gap more intensely than those who were more comfortably fitted into their ego's preferred shape. Rank saw this suffering as the source of creative possibility. The person who felt the gap most keenly was the one most motivated to create, to build something that could hold, in symbolic form, more of what they were than the ordinary social self could contain. Jung saw this too. The creative process, for him, was not the ego's accomplishment. It was the ego in cooperation with the unconscious, the ego providing the form, the craft, the conscious shaping, while the unconscious provided the material, the urgency, the content that exceeded what the ego alone could have generated. The ego's narrow candle was not a limitation to be overcome. It was a specific, valuable, irreplaceable thing. What it needed was relationship with the darkness. Not submersion in it, relationship with it, the candle and the room, each needing the other. The room does not answer. Feel the weight of your body where it rests tonight. The thinking part of you is already quieting, and the larger part, the part that knows how to rest, that has been here all along. Chapter 5. What modern psychology refused. There is a particular kind of dismissal that does not look like dismissal. It looks like a methodological objection. When Jung's contemporaries and the generations of academic psychologists who followed them declined to take seriously the idea of the collective unconscious, they did not always say, "This is wrong." They said, "This cannot be measured." They said, "There is no way to test this." They said, "Science requires falsifiability and archetypes cannot be falsified." These are legitimate methodological concerns. But they function, Jung believed, as a way of pre-deciding what the mind is allowed to contain. If your method can only detect what is observable from the outside, then you have already committed yourself to a theory of mind before you have looked at the mind. You have decided that interior experience is either reducible to behavior or not worth studying. And anything that does not fit, the dreams, the visions, the symbolic material, the repeating mythic patterns across cultures, gets filed under anecdote, under subjective report, under noise. The psychologist Abraham Maslow, working at Brandeis University in the 1960s and early 1970s, grew frustrated with exactly this refusal. Maslow had started as a behaviorist, trained in the tradition that Watson had established, and had gradually concluded that behaviorism was answering the wrong questions. It could explain how rats learned mazes. It could not explain what made a human life feel meaningful. He began studying what he called peak experiences, moments of profound feeling, of connection and awe and self-transcendence that his subjects described as among the most important events of their lives. Moments that bore a striking resemblance to what mystics across traditions had described for centuries. Academic psychology had no category for this. It had no method for this. Maslow built one anyway. He took the interior seriously, and he found something that Jung had already found from a different direction. That the deeper layers of human experience, the symbolic, the felt, the meaningful, were not decorative additions to the mind. They were structural. They were where the most important things happened. The philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty, writing in Paris in the 1940s, argued from phenomenology that consciousness is not a brain event looking out at a world. Consciousness is always already embedded in a body, in a situation, in a web of meanings that precede and exceed rational analysis. The body understands before the mind catches up. Jung would have recognized this. He had been saying something similar from the clinic. The body knows, the dream knows, the symbol knows. And the refusal to study these things is not a neutral methodological choice. It is a philosophical commitment to a particular, very narrow idea of what the mind is. What modern psychology refused was the depth. It was not that the depth was not there. It was that the depth was inconvenient. It could not be quantified. It could not be controlled for. It introduced variability that made clean findings impossible. So it was set aside. Jung refused to set it aside. He built a career, a theoretical system, a clinical practice, and a body of writing that runs to 20 volumes in the collected works, all in the direction of taking the depth seriously. The philosopher of science Karl Popper, whose criterion of falsifiability was precisely the standard used to exclude Jung's collective unconscious from scientific consideration, was in many ways a useful critic. His demand for testable, falsifiable theories produced genuine goods in the domain of science. But Popper's criterion was never meant to be an ontological claim. It was a methodological one. It said, to counter science, a theory must be falsifiable. It did not say, what cannot be tested by the methods of science does not exist. The move from methodological criterion to ontological claim was a philosophical error. And it was an error Jung's critics consistently made. James Hillman, who could be impatient with the scientific establishment's dismissiveness, put it plainly in his 1975 book, Revisioning Psychology. The soul is not stupid, and neither is the imagination. The images arising from the deeper layers of the psyche, the dreams, the visions, the symbolic responses to experience, are not noise. They are data of a particular kind. The fact that they cannot be collected and analyzed by the methods of behavioral psychology does not make them less real. It makes behavioral psychology an insufficient tool for their study. The philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer, writing in Germany in the 1960s on hermeneutics, the art of interpretation, argued that meaning could not be accessed by the methods appropriate to natural science. Meaning required interpretation, and interpretation required the interpreter to risk their own positions, to allow the text or the dream or the symbol to speak in ways that might unsettle what was already believed. The methods of natural science kept the observer separate from the observed. The interpretation of meaning required something else: participation, risk, genuine openness to being changed by what was encountered. This is the spirit in which Jung approached the unconscious. Not as an object to be analyzed from a safe distance, as a subject to be engaged. That is what we are doing tonight. Nothing you hear needs to be held tightly. Just let it move through. Chapter 6. The Psyche Thinks Without Words. You have had the experience. Most people have, though they do not always have language for it. You wake in the morning with a feeling, not a thought, a feeling, a conviction, warm or uneasy, that something has shifted, something has been worked out, or unsettled, or clarified while you slept. The specific content of the dream is gone. Only this residue remains: a mood, a direction, a faint signal from somewhere below. The psyche, Jung believed, had been thinking without words. This was one of his most important claims, and one of the most consistently resisted by the more language-centered traditions of psychology that followed him. The Freudians spoke in verbal terms. Analysis was talking, interpretation was language. The whole apparatus was built on the assumption that what mattered could ultimately be said. Even the unconscious, for Freud, was structured by language. The linguist Jacques Lacan, working in Paris in the 1950s and 1960s, built an elaborate theoretical structure on Freud's insight that the unconscious is structured like a language, a phrase Lacan made famous. It was a brilliant construction. It was also, from Jung's perspective, a construction that was still missing something. Because the psyche does not only think in language, it thinks in images, in sensations, in felt patterns that the body registers before the verbal mind has a chance to form an opinion. Jung observed this in his patients at the Burgolsli Hospital in Zurich in the early 1900s. He was using word association tests, presenting patients with a stimulus word and measuring their response time and their responses. He found that certain words caused delays, tangential responses, sudden blank spots. He called the patterns around these words complexes, charged clusters of association that the conscious mind could not access directly, but that revealed themselves through the disruptions they caused. The complex was thinking. It was organized around an emotional core. It had associations, memories, anticipations attached to it, and it operated independently of the conscious mind's awareness. This was not language, this was structure. something more like music than grammar, patterns of meaning that could be felt before they could be analyzed. The neuroscientist Jung Panksepp, working in the 1980s and 1990s on what he called affective neuroscience, found the neural substrate for something similar. He identified 7 primary emotional systems in mammals, systems that generated motivational states, drove behavior, shaped experience, and found that these systems operated at subcortical levels, below language, below reflective cognition. They were, in his term, the ancient royal roads to the core of the mind. Typal. What Panksepp found in the brain, Jung had found in the clinic. Thinking that was older than words, meaning that moved through the body before it arrived in awareness. This is the psyche thinking without you, or rather, thinking through you in a register you are not trained to recognize. The image that surfaces as you drift towards sleep tonight. The face of someone you had not thought of in years. The specific texture of a remembered room. The feeling of a place you have not visited since childhood. These are not random. The psyche is sorting, organizing, running processes that do not require consciousness to run. You do not need to interpret them. Just notice that something is working quietly in the background. Let it work. Chapter 7. Symbols before rational thought. In 1920, the archaeologist Arthur Evans completed his excavations at Knossos on the island of Crete, a Bronze Age palace complex that had been buried for 3,000 years. Among the most striking things he found was the labyrinth image, the double axe, the bull, not as decorative choice, but as structural presence, woven into architecture and ritual in ways that suggested these images meant something, bore weight, organized the world for the people who lived inside them. Jung was watching this. He was watching archaeology. He was watching comparative mythology. He was reading Richard Wilhelm's translations of Chinese texts, James Fraser's accumulated observations in the Golden Bough, the mythologist Leo Frobenius's accounts of African symbolic systems, and he was seeing the same images everywhere. The Great Mother, the wise old man, the devouring monster, the hero's descent and return, the tree at the center of the world. These were not borrowings. The cultures where these images appeared had had no contact. They had arrived independently at the same symbolic vocabulary. Jung concluded that this was not coincidence. It was structure. The human psyche, he believed, came pre-equipped with certain templates for meaning-making, inherited not as specific images, but as tendencies to produce certain categories of image when the conditions called for them. He called these templates archetypes, from the Greek, meaning original patterns. The philosopher Ernst Cassirer, working in Hamburg in the 1920s and 1930s, approached something similar from a very different direction. Cassirer was a neo-Kantian. He believed in the structuring activity of the human mind, and he developed what he called a philosophy of symbolic forms. He argued that human beings do not encounter the world directly. They encounter it through systems of symbolic mediation, language, myth, art, science, each of which organizes experience according to its own internal logic. What Cassira called symbolic forms, Jung might have recognized as the work of the archetypes. Both men were saying the same thing from different angles. The human encounter with reality is never raw. It is always already shaped by structures the conscious mind did not choose and cannot fully see. The symbol, for Jung, was not just a representation, it was not a sign standing in for something else, the way a red light stands for stop. A symbol was a living thing, something that pointed beyond what could be rationally stated, that carried more meaning than any definition could exhaust. The cross, the mandala, the serpent, the fire. These are symbols in Jung's sense, images that reach below the rational mind and activate something in the deeper layers of the psyche. You do not have to believe in their theological claims to feel their weight. You have felt them. In a dream, in a piece of music, in a moment when an image struck you as important in a way you could not explain. That feeling of unexplained importance is the symbol working. The rational mind says, this is just an image. But the psyche says, this is a door. Jung spent a lifetime on the other side of that door. What he found there was not chaos. It was a different kind of order, an order made of meanings rather than causes, of correspondences rather than mechanisms, of resonance rather than logic. The psychologist James Hillman, reading Jung's work on symbol in the 1960s and 1970s while developing his own archetypal psychology, pushed this further. He was impatient with the tendency, even within Jungian circles, to treat the symbol as a door to something else. As if the mandala were valuable because it pointed toward psychological wholeness, as if the dragon were interesting because it represented the unconscious, as if every image were an allegory waiting to be cashed out in psychological terminology. No, Hillman insisted, the image is where the meaning lives, not behind the image, in it. The dream figure is not a symbol of something the dreamer needs to recognize about themselves. The dream figure is a presence, with its own character and its own agenda, deserving of the same respect you would give a person you had actually met. This was a deepening of Jung's insight rather than a departure from it. What both were pointing at was the same resistance to the reductive move. The move that takes the symbol and converts it back into the rational concepts the rational mind is comfortable with, thereby destroying the specific knowing that only the symbol can carry. The symbol resists this. It keeps meaning more than any translation can hold. The image of the flood, the image of the tower, the image of the descent into the underworld and the return. These are not problems to be solved. They are presences to be inhabited. You have images like this, images that have returned across years, images that carry a specific emotional weight you cannot fully explain. They are not accidents. That order is as real as any other. It is working in you tonight as you rest. Chapter 8. The unconscious has intentions. Here is the thing that made Jung's colleagues most uncomfortable. He did not treat the unconscious as passive. He did not describe it as a storage room, a dump site for repressed experience. a place where unwanted thoughts were sent so the conscious mind could continue functioning. He described it as active, purposive, something that was trying to do something. The unconscious, Jung believed, has intentions. This is a strong claim. It does not mean the unconscious is a separate person planning behind the scenes. It means that the processes running in the unconscious are goal-directed in the same way that biological processes are goal-directed, not through conscious planning, but through the self-regulating dynamics of a complex system. He arrived at this through the clinic. A woman in her mid-40s, Jung would describe patients this way generically to protect them, came to him after years of what she and her doctors were calling depression. She was a successful professional, competent, organized, functioning in her daily life. But something was wrong, and the wrongness was not localized to any identifiable event or relationship. She began bringing her dreams. Over weeks, the dreams formed a pattern. The same figure appeared repeatedly. An old woman, wise and somewhat frightening, who kept leading the patient toward a door the patient was afraid to open. The old woman was not threatening. She was insistent. Jung recognized this as the archetype he called the wise old woman, one of the Great Mother's more instructive aspects. And he recognized the pattern as the unconscious doing something, guiding, pushing towards something the conscious mind was avoiding. The door, over months of work, turned out to be a life that the patient had set aside, a creative capacity, an inner life she had decided was not practical. The unconscious had been holding it for her. And the dream figures were not random. They were the psyche's way of saying, there is something here you have not attended to. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur, working on what he called the hermeneutics of suspicion in the 1960s, argued that the great masters of this suspicion, Freud, Marx, Nietzsche, had taught us to read beneath the surface, to find behind the stated meaning the hidden motive. Ricoeur saw Freud as the most psychologically sophisticated of these masters. But Jung's version of suspicion was different in character. Freud's unconscious was suspicious in the sense of harbor dark. What lurked below was what you did not want to face. Jung's unconscious was suspicious in a different sense. It was wiser than the ego. It was trying to move you in a direction the ego was too narrow to see. The dream that wakes you with a feeling of unease is not necessarily warning you of danger. It may be warning you that you are asleep in your life, that you have been managing surface without attending to depth, and that something in the deeper layers wants you to turn around. The analyst James Hollis, who has spent a long career applying Jung's thought to the second half of life, describes it this way. The unconscious is always asking what is seeking to enter the world through this particular person at this particular time. Not what you should do. What is trying to happen. There is something trying to happen in you. It has been patient. It can wait. Chapter 9. Anxiety from the deeper mind. It arrives often at night. A tightness in the chest that has no specific cause. A restlessness in the body even as the body lies still. a vague, hovering unease that you might call dread if that word were not too large, and worry if that word were not too small. Something in between, something without an object. You know the feeling. Jung was deeply interested in anxiety, not the ordinary fear that has a clear referent, the car skidding, the phone ringing with bad news, but the more diffuse, more structural anxiety that cannot be attached to a specific cause. He believed this kind of anxiety was often a signal from the deeper mind, not a malfunction, a message. Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher writing in Copenhagen in the 1840s, had described anxiety as the dizziness of freedom, the vertiginous feeling that comes when you realize you must choose, that the self is not fixed, that who you are is not given, but made through the choices you make moment by moment. Kierkegaard was not a psychologist. He was a theologian and a philosopher, but Jung read him and saw in Kierkegaard's analysis of anxiety something clinically important. The anxiety was not the problem. It was the signal of a problem. It was what happened when the freedom to be someone was not being used, when the psyche was pressing toward growth and the ego was resisting. Rollo May, the American existential psychologist who wrote The Meaning of Anxiety in 1950, drew directly on both Kierkegaard and Jung. He distinguished between normal anxiety, the appropriate response to genuine threat or genuine possibility, and neurotic anxiety, which arose when the person could not move toward the growth that was being called for. Neurotic anxiety, in May's analysis, was the energy of potential turned inward. The life trying to expand, and the person, for reasons that were almost always understandable, refusing the expansion. Jung had said something similar from within the clinic. When a patient came to him with anxiety that had no identifiable external cause, he was interested not in removing the anxiety, but in understanding what the anxiety was about, what had not been lived, what had been set aside, what the psyche was storing because the conscious mind had decided it could not be held. The psychologist Eugene Gendlin, a student of Carl Rogers at the University of Chicago in the 1950s and 1960s, developed a technique he called focusing. What he found, studying what differentiated therapy that produced change from therapy that did not, was a specific bodily process. A particular kind of attention to what he called the felt sense, the vague, whole body sense of a problem or situation that was more than and different from any specific emotion. The felt sense was not the same as anxiety. It was the body's pre-verbal knowing about a situation, something the body registered before the mind had words for it, something that shifted when you paid attention to it with the right quality of attention. Gendlin's finding was that clients who could access the felt sense in session, who could slow down enough to notice what was happening in the body around a problem, not just what they thought about it, made progress. Clients who could not or did not tended to stay in the same circular conversations. The anxiety you feel at night has a felt sense. Not the story around it, not the bills and the relationships and the decisions. The felt sense underneath those. A particular quality in the chest, or the throat, or the stomach. Something that is not yet a word. Jung would have recognized Gendlin's finding as confirmation of what the clinical work had always shown. The deeper material lives in the body first. The psychological process begins below language. And the healing, when it comes through that layer before it arrives in the layer of understanding. The anxiety that visits you at 2 inches a morning, when the defenses are thinner and the distractions have gone quiet, that anxiety is not random, it is specific. It may not be specific to a bill, a relationship, a health concern, though it may attach to those. Beneath the specific attachment is something more structural. The sense that something is unlived, that the life being lived and the life that is possible are farther apart than they should be. The gap between those two lives is where anxiety lives. Jung did not believe this gap could be closed by willpower or by cognitive reframing. It could be closed by living more of what the psyche was carrying, by attending to the dreams, the symbolic material, the neglected capacities, by moving, however slowly, in the direction the deeper mind was asking. Tonight, the anxiety, if it is there, does not need to be solved. It needs to be heard, and then, for tonight, set gently down. Let your breath settle. The question can wait until morning. Chapter 10. Dreams as Autonomous Messages. In 1900, Sigmund Freud published The Interpretation of Dreams, the work he always considered his most important. Freud's argument was that dreams were disguised wish fulfillments. The unconscious dressed its desires in strange costume so the sleeping ego would not be disturbed. The analyst's task was to strip the costume and reveal the wish beneath. Jung had studied under Freud's influence. He had used Freud's framework, and then, incrementally, through the evidence of his own patients' dreams, he had moved away from it. The dreams he was seeing did not feel like disguised wishes. They felt like communications from something other than the part of the person that wished for things. He began calling dreams autonomous messages, not products of the ego, not distorted versions of what the ego wanted. Messages from the objective psyche, his term for the psyche as it exists independently of the ego's wishes and fears. The word autonomous was important to him. The dream figure does not do what the dreamer wants. It does not say what the ego would say. It arrives with its own character, its own logic, its own agenda. And often, this was what struck Jung most repeatedly in the clinic. It arrives with information the ego did not have. A man who had been denying the severity of his isolation dreamed repeatedly of empty rooms. Not threatening rooms, just empty. And in the emptiness, a silence so complete it had weight. He had not told Jung he was lonely. He had barely told himself. The dream said it plainly. A woman who had been treating a relationship as more solid than it was dreamed of, standing on a bridge that was missing planks. She was being very careful where she stepped. She had not, in her waking analysis, been careful at all. The dream was compensating. This was the principle Jung found most consistently. Dreams compensate. They do not confirm what the ego already knows. They offer what the ego is missing. They correct the one-sidedness that the conscious attitude inevitably develops when it gets too confident in its position. The Jungian analyst Marie-Louise von Franz, who worked closely with Jung in Küsnacht, Switzerland in the 1940s and 1950s, spent a long career studying fairy tales and myths as extended dreams of the culture, autonomous productions of the collective psyche, bearing the same compensatory function at a cultural level. She wrote beautifully about how the fairy tale knows what the culture needs to hear, not what it wants to hear, but what it has been avoiding. The dream is the individual's fairy tale. It knows what you need, it does not flatter, and it does not require analysis to do its work. You do not need a Jungian analyst to make use of dreams. What you need is attention, the willingness to ask, upon waking with a strong image or feeling, what was that about? Not what does it mean in some ultimate sense, but what was it touching? What does the psyche consider important enough to send you while you sleep? The analyst Edward Edinger, who wrote with particular precision about what he called the ego-self axis, described the compensatory dream as a kind of corrective feedback loop. When the ego had strayed too far from the center, had become too identified with its persona, too controlled, too one-sided in its orientation, the self-generated dreams that pushed in the opposite direction, disturbing dreams sometimes, dreams that challenged the ego's preferred story, dreams that said, "This is not the whole picture. There is more here that you are not seeing." Edinger's clinical observation was that patients who were progressing in their psychological development tended to have more vivid dreams, not fewer. The unconscious became more active as the ego developed the capacity to receive what it was sending. The channel opened in both directions. This is important to note, because many people experience vivid dreaming as a sign that something is wrong, that the sleep is disturbed, that the psyche is in disorder. Sometimes it is. But often, the vividness is a sign of contact. The psyche is working something through and using the ego's relative openness in sleep to do it. What von Franz observed in decades of working with dreams was that the recurring dream, the dream that appears again and again over years with minor variations, was the most important dream. Not the dramatic one-off, the quiet, persistent, returning image. That image was marking something the unconscious had identified as centrally important and had not yet been able to deliver fully into consciousness. If there is a dream you have had more than once, a place, a situation, a figure that keeps coming back, it is not random repetition, it is insistence. The psyche keeps sending the message until it is received. Tonight, as you drift, whatever comes is not nothing. It is the deeper mind working on your behalf. Let it work. Chapter 11. Why Images No More. Language is sequential. One word follows another. A sentence moves in one direction at a time. You can only say one thing at once. An image contains many things at once. Jung believed this was why the psyche communicated in images, not because it was primitive, because it was precise in a different register than language could manage. When you dream of a house, a recurring image Jung found in many of his patients, the house is not a symbol standing in for one thing. It is a whole container of meanings simultaneously present, shelter and enclosure, what is known and what is hidden, the self and its architecture, the past and its rooms. A single word like house cannot carry all of that. The image does, effortlessly, in the instant of its appearance. The philosopher Gaston Bachelard, writing in Paris in the 1950s, devoted an entire book, The Poetics of Space, to this question. He explored the phenomenology of inhabited space, the corner, the nest, the chest, the miniature, the vast. He argued that images of intimate space are not just memories or metaphors. They are ways the psyche organizes experience. The house we grew up in, Bachelard wrote, is still inside us, not as a fact, but as a pattern of feeling, a constellation of associations that shapes how we experience enclosure and openness for the rest of our lives. This is image knowing, not conceptual, not propositional, a kind of knowledge that lives in the body's memory of spaces and sensations, and that influences cognition without passing through rational analysis. Jung called this kind of knowledge the kind carried by images, symbols, the body's memory of the world, the province of the unconscious. The rational ego thinks in language. The deeper psyche thinks in images. And between these two modes of thought runs a translation problem that neither side can solve alone. The painter Paul Klee, who was working at the Bauhaus in Germany in the 1920s at the same time Jung was developing his mature theory, said something that Jung would have recognized. Art does not reproduce the visible, it makes visible. It brings to the surface of the image something that cannot be reached by description alone. This is what the dream does. It makes visible what the words could not say. The psychotherapist Marian Woodman, a Jungian analyst working in Toronto in the 1980s and 1990s, focused much of her practice on the body's symbolic language, the way that what could not be said in words was held in tension, in posture, in the body's habits of contraction and release. The image the body carries is the oldest image. It predates childhood, it predates memory. It lives in the reflexes, in the breath, in the way the shoulders have learned to brace. When the image surfaces, in a dream, in a moment of recognition, in the strange feeling that a particular piece of music is saying something you could not say, it is bringing to awareness something that has been known for a long time without being conscious. Images know more because they carry more, because they do not have to choose between meanings, because they do not have to follow rules that language follows. The image that comes to you tonight, whatever it is, carries more than you know. The philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, writing in the 1920s and 1930s at Harvard after his earlier career in mathematics, developed a philosophy he called process philosophy, a vision of reality in which what was most fundamental was not substance but event, not static being but dynamic becoming. The universe, in Whitehead's vision, was not a collection of things but a network of processes, each influencing and constituting every other. Jung found in Whitehead a philosophical companion. What Whitehead was describing at the level of cosmology was parallel to what Jung was describing at the level of the psyche, a reality that could not be captured by the snapshot, only by the process. The psyche was not a thing, it was a movement, a continuous becoming, a system that was always already in motion, always already in relationship with its own depths. This is why the island image ultimately falls short, as all images do. The island is too static. It implies a fixed boundary between the above surface and the below surface. But the psyche's dynamics are more fluid than that. The unconscious is not separated from consciousness by a fixed shoreline. Material moves across constantly. Complexes activate and subside. Archetypes emerge and recede. Dreams open channels and the channels slowly close. The relationship between consciousness and the unconscious is not a boundary but a conversation. An ongoing, always incomplete, sometimes difficult conversation between the part that knows it is alive and the part that holds more of the living. The psychologist D.W. Winnicott, approaching this from the direction of object relations theory in London in the 1950s and 1960s, described what he called transitional space, the space between the inner and outer world, between subjective experience and objective reality, where all of the most important human activities happened. Art, play, religion, creativity, these were all transitional phenomena, neither fully inner nor fully outer, neither fully conscious nor fully unconscious. The island, in Winnicott's revision, is always already touching the sea through this transitional zone. The shore is the most alive part. That is where we have been living tonight. Let your eyes soften behind their lids. The knowing does not require your effort. Chapter 12, Consciousness as a Small Island. Carl Jung used many images for the relationship between consciousness and the unconscious. The candle and the dark room, the cork and the ocean. But perhaps the most persistent, the one he returned to most often in his clinical and theoretical writing, was the island. Consciousness is a small island, he wrote, risen above the surface of a vast sea. The island is real. It is the only part we live on. But beneath the surface, the island extends, far downward into depths we cannot see, connected to other islands by the ocean floor, part of something enormously larger than what appears above the waterline. This image is not meant to diminish consciousness. The island is where life happens, where choices are made, where relationships are built. But the island is shaped by what is below. The currents of the deeper ocean determine where sand accumulates, where the shoreline erodes, what grows in the soil. The island thinks it is self-determining. It is, but only partly. The psychologist James Hillman, who studied under Jung in Zurich and then spent his career developing what he called archetypal psychology, pushed this insight further than Jung had taken it. Hillman argued that the bias toward consciousness was itself a problem, that the Western psychological tradition and much of the philosophical tradition that preceded it had systematically undervalued the imaginal, the soulful, the image-based dimensions of mental life in favor of ego clarity and rational control. He called this bias the literalism of the ego. The ego insists on knowing what something means, on resolving ambiguity, on converting symbolic material into practical guidance. And in doing so, it strips the image of its power. It turns the dream into a problem to be solved rather than a presence to be inhabited. The ocean beneath the island, in Hillman's deepened version of Jung's image, is not just the repository of what the ego has not processed. It is the source of the ego's life. The ego is fed from below. The images rising from the depths are not noise to be converted into signal. They are the primary material of psychic life. The anthropologist Clifford Geertz, writing about culture in the 1970s, described human beings as suspended in webs of significance we ourselves have spun. What he meant was that meaning is not something we add to experience, it is the medium through which experience is possible. We live inside meaning the way we live inside air. Jung would say the same about the unconscious. We do not possess it, we live inside it. Consciousness is the part where we are awake. The unconscious is the part where the rest of life, including the life that makes conscious life possible, is quietly running. This is not a frightening idea, held gently enough. The island does not have to understand the ocean to float. The sea carries it. Let your breath move like water tonight, without forcing, without stopping, just flowing in and out in its own time. The island is safe. Chapter 13. The personal unconscious watches. Jung distinguished between two layers of the unconscious. The deeper layer, the collective unconscious, he believed, was inherited, transpersonal, shared across humanity, older than any individual life. We return to it later. But there is a shallower layer, more familiar, more personal. Jung called it the personal unconscious. And unlike the collective unconscious, this layer is made of material from your own life. What kind of material? Everything that was once conscious but has been forgotten. Everything that entered your experience without ever quite reaching the level of full awareness. Impressions, perceptions, feelings that registered below the threshold of attention. Everything that was, at some point, too painful or too inconvenient or simply too large for the ego to hold, and so was pushed below the surface. This layer is watching, not ominously, but persistently. It has been observing everything that has happened in your life, including, especially, the things the conscious mind has decided to minimize or set aside. It holds the full account, the version of events without the edits. The psychoanalytic tradition had long recognized something like this. Freud had the repression model, painful material pushed into the unconscious, where it caused symptoms. The traumatic theorists who came later, including Bessel van der Kolk in his work at Boston University in the 1980s and 1990s, found that traumatic experience was stored differently from ordinary memory, not as a narrative that could be recalled and told, but as fragments, as body sensations, as intrusive images that arrived without the context that would make them interpretable. Van der Kolk's phrase is one of the most precise descriptions of the personal unconscious's watching function. The body keeps the score. What the mind has filed away, the body holds in its own notation. In the shoulder, that will not release. In the startle response that fires at sounds that are not threatening. In the breath that stays shallow even in safety. The personal unconscious does not only hold what was traumatic, it holds what was simply unfinished. The argument that was never resolved. The grief that was abbreviated. The ambition that was set aside when life demanded something more practical. The version of yourself you were before you learned to be the version you became. All of that is in the personal unconscious. Not inert, not neutral, active, continuing to press against the floor of consciousness. Leaking through in dreams, in sudden moods, in the strange associations that appear when you are tired and the defenses are thinner. The philosopher Edmund Husserl, working in Freiburg in the early 20th century and developing what would become phenomenology, described something he called the retentional structure of experience, the way each present moment carries within it the just past and the about to come, the way consciousness is never just a single point in time, but always already threaded through with what has been. The personal unconscious is the long version of Husserl's retention. Everything that has been, but not just the last few seconds, everything carried forward. A man in his late 60s came to Jung having spent his entire adult life as a man of action, a practical man, a man who built things. He came not because of crisis. The crisis was more like a slow erosion, a hollowness he could not explain. In the first months of work together, the dreams brought his mother. Not his actual mother, but a maternal figure who was holding something she had been waiting to give him. He had not thought of his mother, who had died when he was a young man, as someone who had been waiting. The personal unconscious had been holding what the conscious man had not made room for. That is what the personal unconscious does. It waits and holds and watches. It has been patient with you. Chapter 14. Complexes that quietly think. The word complex in ordinary speech means complicated. In Jung's vocabulary, it means something more specific and more important. A complex is a cluster of emotionally charged material in the unconscious, a constellation of associations, memories, impulses, and feelings gathered around a central emotional theme, organized by something that feels like an autonomous core. The complex has energy. It has its own perspective. And it does not always tell the ego what it is doing. Jung discovered complexes through his word association work at the Bergholzli Hospital in the early 1900s. He would present a word, father, money, love, death, and measure the response time. He found that certain words produced delays, that certain responses were oddly tangential, that certain stimulus words caused the patient to lose the thread. These disruptions were not random. They clustered. They pointed to emotionally loaded territories in the unconscious. He called these territories complexes. And over years of clinical observation, he found that they behaved in certain conditions almost like separate personalities, subsystems of the psyche with their own affect, their own logic, their own way of shaping the person's relationship to the world. You know your complexes, though you probably do not call them that. You know them by the disproportionate reaction, the moment when something small triggers something enormous, when the response is too large for the stimulus. A careless comment that should not matter and yet sends you somewhere deep. A minor criticism that lands like a verdict. A passing resemblance between a present situation and an old wound, and suddenly the old wound is fully awake. That is the complex activating. It has been quietly thinking, making associations, preparing to respond. And when the trigger arrives, it responds, not with the measured, contextually appropriate reaction of the ego, but with the full force of everything it has been carrying. The psychologist Alfred Adler, who like Jung had been part of Freud's inner circle before departing to develop his own theory, had noticed something similar. He called it the inferiority complex, a specific emotional constellation organized around the experience of inadequacy. Adler's observation was that this complex, far from being pathological, was nearly universal. Everyone had experienced it. What differed was whether the person had found constructive or destructive ways of responding. Jung broadened this. He believed everyone had multiple complexes, not just around inferiority, but around the whole range of emotionally significant themes. The mother complex, the father complex, the power complex, the failure complex, the love complex. Each organized around a wound or a hunger or a formative experience that had left its mark on the deeper layers of the psyche. And each, under ordinary circumstances, thinks quietly, monitors the environment for relevant stimuli, waits for the trigger. The work Jung proposed was not to eliminate the complex. He did not believe that was possible or even desirable. The complex carried energy. That energy could be used. What was needed was to establish a relationship between the ego and the complex, to recognize when the complex was running the show, to bring consciousness to what had been operating in the dark. Not to defeat the complex, to know it. There is something running in you tonight that you have known for a long time without naming. The developmental psychologist Daniel Stern, working in the tradition of infant observation research in New York in the 1980s, described what he called affective attunement, the way a healthy caregiver matches the emotional state of the infant, not by mimicking the expression exactly, but by finding a cross-modal equivalent. The infant bangs its hand with excitement. The mother responds with a rhythmic vocalization that matches the energy without repeating the act. The infant learns, my inner state can be met, can be recognized, can be shared. What happens when this attunement is absent, when the emotional state is consistently not met? When the child's excitement or anger or fear finds no responding presence, is that the state goes underground, not resolved, filed. The child learns to stop expressing what is not met, and over time stops knowing fully what it is feeling. The complex, in Jung's framework, forms partly around these unmet states. The emotional charge of the original experience, the hunger for recognition that was not given, the anger that was not permitted, the grief that no one could hold, remains active in the unconscious. Organized around the original wound, primed to respond when anything in the present echoes the original situation. This is why the complex, when it activates, carries such a charge. It is not responding only to the present situation. It is responding to everything in its cluster, the long history of similar moments, accumulated over years, all activated simultaneously by the current trigger. Jung's clinical work with complexes was slow because it was thorough. He was not trying to diffuse the emotional charge. He was trying to bring consciousness into relationship with the complex, to let the ego know the complex, to let the complex be known. Not agreement, not merger, recognition. Something running in you tonight has been waiting for this. It means no harm. It just wants to be seen. Chapter 15. The shadow has its own logic. The shadow. It is the concept Jung is most associated with in popular culture, and also the one most frequently misunderstood. The shadow is not evil. It is not the dark side that needs to be eliminated. It is not the enemy. The shadow is everything the ego has decided it cannot be. It begins in childhood. The child is born with a full range of human capacities: aggression and tenderness, ambition and passivity, joy and grief, envy and generosity. But the environment, the family, the culture, the religion, the school responds differently to different expressions of this range. Some things are welcomed. Others are met with disapproval, or silence, or punishment, or simply the withdrawal of love. The child learns. It learns which parts of itself are acceptable and which are not. And the parts that are not acceptable do not disappear. They go underground. They become the shadow, the part of the self that lives in the unconscious, that the ego does not claim, that the person sincerely believes is not part of who they are. But the shadow has its own logic. It exerts pressure. It finds expression in dreams, in slips, in the behavior you engage in when no one is watching, in the disproportionate reaction to other people who embody what you have suppressed. The rage at the colleague's arrogance, that is really the rage of your own suppressed ambition. The contempt for the needy person that is really the contempt you have been taught to feel toward your own need. Jung described projection as the primary mechanism by which the shadow operates. What you cannot acknowledge in yourself, you see clearly in others. The world becomes a screen onto which the shadow casts its contents. And you walk around believing that the problem is out there, in them, in the culture, in the people who are so obviously inferior or dangerous or morally wrong. While what is actually happening is that you are looking at your own unconscious from the outside. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, writing in the 1880s from his rooms in various European boarding houses, rooms he moved through constantly, in search of a climate his failing body could tolerate, had described something he called the herd morality. The morality that told the individual to suppress strength, to deny ambition, to perform goodness while harboring the opposite. What Nietzsche was describing, without Jung's clinical framework, was the shadow operating at a cultural level, the collective denial of what the culture has decided it cannot be. Robert Johnson, a Jungian analyst who wrote with unusual clarity about the shadow in his 1991 book, Owning Your Own Shadow, described the shadow as gold in the dark. Not only the primitive and destructive, though that is there too, but the unlived gifts, the suppressed creativity, the capacity for joy that was deemed inappropriate or dangerous. The shadow is where the person you could have been is waiting. The shadow has its own logic, because it has its own history. It was formed in response to real experience. It made sense at the time to push those things underground. The conditions that required it may no longer exist. What is in your shadow does not have to stay there. It simply needs to be acknowledged. Not claimed entirely, not acted out, seen. Notice your breath. Notice whatever is present without naming it. That is already a beginning. Chapter 16. Projection and hidden awareness. There is a particular clarity you have about other people that you do not have about yourself. You can see the patterns in your colleague's behavior, the way he always has to be right, the way he retreats when challenged. You can see the dynamic in your friend's relationship, the way she repeats the same argument with different men. You can see the vanity in the neighbor, the insecurity in the public figure on the screen, the cowardice in the person who does not speak up when they should. Your vision is often correct. But Jung was interested in a specific subset of these perceptions, the ones that carry heat. When another person's behavior merely puzzles or saddens you, that is one thing. But when it irritates you, when it produces a disproportionate reaction, a tightening, a specific kind of righteous or contemptuous feeling, Jung thought you were likely looking at your own shadow. He called this projection, not because the other person's behavior was imaginary, the behavior was usually real enough, but because the emotional charge you brought to it was loaded with something of your own, something you had not claimed. The most reliable sign of projection, Jung believed, was the quality of the emotional reaction. Neutral observation does not project. But the hot, specific, slightly obsessive quality of moral outrage, of contempt, of fascination tinged with disgust, these were fingerprints of the shadow. The person who is most offended by another's laziness is often carrying a great deal of suppressed laziness. The person who cannot tolerate another's self-pity has not given their own grief any room. The person who reacts most strongly to another's dishonesty may be the most tightly controlled around their own impulses to deceive. None of this means the other person is actually fine. The point is not about them. The point is about the emotional surplus, the additional charge beyond what the situation calls for, that is, your own material pressing outward. The philosopher and theologian Paul Tillich, working in New York in the 1950s, and in dialogue with the same existential tradition that Jung was drawing from, described what he called the courage to be, the willingness to acknowledge one's own existence, one's own nature, even the parts that were difficult or unwelcome. Projection was, in Tillich's terms, a failure of this courage, a refusal of one's own content by externalizing it. Jung saw withdrawal of projection as one of the most important tasks of psychological development. Not a one-time achievement, a continuous, lifelong practice of asking, what is mine here? What is in this reaction that belongs to me rather than to them? This is not a comfortable practice. It requires a kind of honesty that the ego resists strenuously, because the ego has organized itself precisely around not seeing these things. The projection is a protection. Withdrawing it means taking back what you put outside, and that means acknowledging it as yours. But withdrawal of projection is also the beginning of genuine relationship. When you stop seeing the other person as a screen for your own shadow material, you begin to see them as they actually are, with their own complexity, their own shadow, their own unlived life. The world gets larger when you withdraw your projections. People get more interesting. Let that settle. Chapter 17, The Inner Critic of Conscious Life. You know the voice. Not loud, usually. Not dramatic. Something quieter. A running commentary, often delivered in a flat, reasonable tone on the distance between what you are and what you should be. Too slow, too cautious, too emotional. Should have said something, should not have said that. Did not do enough today, should have more to show for these years. Jung did not name this voice the inner critic. That language came later, from the clinicians who developed his work. He called what generated it a complex, specifically what he associated with what he called the inferior function, the least developed side of the person's psychological type. The voice was the unconscious pushing back against the ego's preferred way of operating. But the voice is also connected to something Jung called the superego in the Freudian vocabulary, and which, in his own framework, he associated with the negative mother complex or the negative father complex, the internalized voice of parental or cultural authority that continues to evaluate and judge long after the actual. Parents have left the room. This voice was formed early. It was formed in response to real feedback from real people who had real power over the child's survival. When the parent said, "You should know better," something in the child filed that away, not just as a memory, but as a template. A template for the internal evaluator that would, in time, say you should know better on its own, without needing the original voice. The psychologist Alice Miller, writing in Switzerland in the 1970s and 1980s, spent a career examining the ways parental expectation becomes internalized as self-judgment. Her book, The Drama of the Gifted Child, published in 1979, described the child who learns to adapt their inner life to what the parent needs, and who arrives in adulthood without a clear sense of what they themselves actually feel or want. The inner critic, in Miller's framework, is the voice of the adapted self policing the true self. Donald Winnicott had described the same dynamic a generation earlier in slightly different terms: the false self building a wall around the true self, protecting it by never letting it be seen. The inner critic is, at its core, a protection mechanism that has outlived its usefulness. It was necessary once. It helped you navigate a world where the wrong kind of behavior had real consequences. But the world has changed, or at least enough of it has changed, that the critic's standard operating procedure, constant monitoring, constant evaluation, constant comparison to an impossible standard, is no longer serving you. Jung believed the relationship with this voice could change. Not that it could be silenced. Trying to silence the complex only drives it deeper. But the ego could begin to differentiate itself from the critic, to recognize when the voice was speaking, to hear it as one input rather than the verdict. The critic says, "You have not done enough." The self, underneath the critic, says, "I am here, I am trying, that is real." Both are true. Let your jaw soften. Let your hands unclench. The critic can rest tonight. Chapter 18. Why Reason Misses the Soul. At some point in the 17th century, something shifted in the European mind. René Descartes, writing in the warmth of a Bavarian stoveroom in 1619, had an experience he described as a series of extraordinary visions. A night of dreams so vivid and coherent that he took them as a divine revelation that led him to the insight that became the foundation of modern rationalism. He would doubt everything that could be doubted. What could not be doubted was the act of doubting itself. I think, therefore I am. The thinking self became the ground, not the feeling self, not the dreaming self, not the body's knowing, the reasoning mind. This was a revolution in consciousness. It was also, Jung believed, a narrowing. The subsequent 3 centuries of Western intellectual life had built enormous achievements on Descartes' foundation. Science, technology, medicine, democracy, the systematic reduction of superstition, and the expansion of reliable knowledge about the physical world. These achievements were real, were extraordinary, were not to be abandoned. But something was lost in the transaction. The soul, in the sense Jung meant it, not the theological sense, but the psychological sense. The inner life organized around meaning rather than mechanism had been progressively evacuated from the official story of what a human being was. By the 19th century, when the Enlightenment had run its fullest course, a human being was, in the dominant scientific account, a body in mechanical motion, generating mental states as a byproduct of neural events. Consciousness was an epiphenomenon. Meaning was a feeling, and feelings were chemical. The inner life was real as subjective experience, but not real as a domain of knowledge. Jung thought this was catastrophic. Not because science was wrong about what it had studied, but because it had decided it had studied everything. And in the areas it had not studied, the areas of symbolic meaning, of mythic imagination, of the soul's way of organizing experience, the modern human being was left entirely without resources. The philosopher Henri Bergson, working in Paris in the early 20th century, made an argument Jung found useful, that the intellect was a tool shaped by evolution to analyze matter, to break things into parts, to understand mechanisms, to predict and control. What the intellect could not do was grasp life, movement, duration, the continuous flow of experience. For that, you needed a different faculty, what Bergson called intuition, a kind of direct sympathy with the object of knowledge. Jung would have said, "For the soul, you need the symbolic life, the engagement with myth, dream, image, ritual, not as supplementary decoration for the rational life, as the foundation. When reason is the only tool, the soul becomes invisible. And the invisible soul does not go away, it goes underground. It becomes the symptom, the depression, the anxiety without a cause, the hollow feeling in the chest after a perfectly productive day. Reason misses the soul, because it cannot measure the soul. But the soul is there nonetheless." The cultural historian Maurice Berman, in his 1981 book, The Re-Enchantment of the World, traced the arc of this narrowing with precision. He showed how the European mind, between roughly 1500 and 1700, moved from what he called participating consciousness, a mode in which the human being felt themselves embedded in a meaningful cosmos, connected to the forces and patterns around them by more than mechanical causation, to the detached, observational consciousness of modern science. The shift was necessary. The old participating consciousness was also a consciousness entangled with superstition, with fear, with the projection of human categories onto nature. The scientific revolution cleared this. It made possible the extraordinary accumulation of reliable knowledge about the physical world. But Berman's argument was that something was lost that had not been replaced. The sense of being inside a meaningful world, not as projection, but as genuine participation, had been dissolved without a new form of that participation being provided. This is what Jung called the loss of the symbolic life. The modern person was not less in need of meaning than the medieval person. They were more in need because the external structures that had once provided it, the church, the community, the ritual calendar, had thinned or disappeared. And the internal capacity for symbolic engagement had been systematically undervalued by every educational institution and cultural authority. The soul did not disappear. but it was left without a language the culture recognized. So it spoke in symptoms. Somewhere beneath the thinking you have been doing tonight, something is feeling. Let it. Chapter 19. Archetypes older than memory. You have never met Merlin. You have never met the Great Mother. You have never met the trickster, or the hero, or the wise old man who appears at the crossroads when you do not know which way to go. And yet you know them, not from books, though books have carried them, not from religion, though religion has clothed them. You know them from something prior to all of that, something in the architecture of the psyche itself that responds to these patterns the way a key responds to the lock it was made for. This was Jung's claim about archetypes. Not that they were cultural inventions transmitted from one civilization to the next. Not that every human being had heard the same stories, but that the human psyche came equipped with certain predispositions, templates for response, for meaning, for emotional organization, that generated these recurring patterns across time and geography. The archetype itself is not the image. The archetype is the invisible structure, the inherited predisposition, the template. The image, the wise old man, the great mother, the divine child, is what the archetype produces when it encounters the specific material of a life, a culture, a historical moment. The anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, working in the tradition of structural anthropology in Paris in the 1950s and 1960s, found something similar from a very different direction. He analyzed myths from cultures across the world, from South America, from North America, from Oceania, and found not just surface similarities, but deep structural patterns. Binary oppositions resolved by a mediating third. The raw and the cooked. Nature and culture. Life. He believed these structures were not cultural borrowings, but something built into the way the human mind organized meaning. Lévi-Strauss was a structuralist, not a Jungian. He distrusted Jung's formulations as too speculative. But the conversation between their findings is unavoidable. Both were pointing at the same thing from different angles. The human mind does not encounter the world as a blank slate. It comes equipped. The archetype of the Great Mother, to take one example, does not require that you have a particular mother or a particular religious tradition. It activates in response to experiences of nourishment and deprivation, of comfort and abandonment, of the overwhelming closeness and the terrible distance that characterize the first relationship every human being has. The archetype is the pattern that makes those experiences cohere into a meaning, that organizes them into a figure that the psyche can relate to. Marie-Louise von Franz, in her long career of comparative mythological study, described the archetype as the psyche's way of making the universal personal. The archetype in abstract is not felt. The archetype in the image, the specific old woman in the specific dream, the specific quality of light in the specific remembered moment, is felt with the whole body. The archetypes are older than any civilization you know. They were old before writing. They were old before agriculture. They are the shape of the human encounter with what is largest. And they are in you tonight, in the deep structure of every dream you will have. You have always carried them. Chapter 20. The Collective Unconscious Moves. In 1914, something extraordinary began to happen that Jung could not initially explain. In the months before the outbreak of World War I, before anyone had reason to expect the apocalypse that was coming, Jung began having waking visions. He saw Europe covered in blood. He saw a yellow wave rolling from the north, a tide of something that left devastation in its wake. He heard a voice telling him these images were real. He feared for his sanity. A psychiatrist seeing visions of catastrophe was not, professionally, in an ideal position. And then August 1914 arrived. The war began. Jung did not claim to have predicted the war. He was too careful for that kind of grandiosity. But he reflected for years on what had happened, on what kind of mental process could have registered the approach of such an event, and he came to a conclusion that shaped his theoretical work for the rest of his life. The collective unconscious moves. It is not static. It is not simply a library of inherited templates. It is alive, responsive to the conditions of the culture, generating pressure when those conditions move toward rupture, sending signals upward through the psyche of those who are sensitive enough or unfortunate enough to receive them. He began to think of the collective unconscious as something like a shared sea. All individual consciousnesses are islands above it. The sea is continuous beneath. What moves in the depths moves through all of us simultaneously, though most of us register the movement only as a vague unease, a quality of the times, a collective mood we cannot quite account for. The sociologist Émile Durkheim, working in Paris at the turn of the 20th century, had developed the concept of collective representations, the shared symbols, rituals, and beliefs through which a society organizes its collective life. These representations were not merely the sum of individual beliefs, they had a reality of their own. They shaped individual thought from the outside while feeling like the individual's own convictions. Jung was making a similar claim from the inside. The collective layer of the psyche was not just the result of cultural transmission. It was a stratum of mental life that preceded culture, that culture was an expression of, that moved independently of any individual's choices. The philosopher Carl Gustav Carus, a German physician and philosopher writing in the 1840s, one of the first to systematically theorize the unconscious before either Freud or Jung, had described the unconscious as the foundation of conscious life in a way that Jung later acknowledged as prescient. Carus saw the unconscious not as a source of pathology, but as the ground of vitality, of creativity, of the generative force in human life. When the collective unconscious moves, individuals feel it before they understand it. The restlessness in a culture before a great change. The specific quality of collective anxiety that precedes collapse or transformation. The simultaneous emergence of new ideas in thinkers who have not read each other and who live on different continents. These are the movements of the shared sea. The sea is moving now. As it always has been, you are part of it. Let the feeling of being held by something larger than yourself. Be, for tonight, a comfort rather than a weight. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. Chapter 21. Mental Health Beyond Mechanism. There is a man, call him Thomas, in his mid-50s, sitting in an office that smells of old paper across from a clinician who is going through a checklist. Sleep disrupted, appetite variable, mood persistently low, duration 18 months. The checklist produces a diagnosis. The diagnosis points to a treatment protocol. The treatment protocol involves medication and structured cognitive work. These are good tools. Thomas's sleep improves. His appetite returns. He functions at a higher level. And yet Thomas, in the quiet of the night, still has the feeling that something essential has been missed. Not the symptoms, those are better, but the question beneath the symptoms. The question that the symptoms were, perhaps, trying to ask. Jung would have been interested in that question. He was not opposed to symptom relief. He was a clinician. He valued reduced suffering. But he believed that the symptomatic approach, the approach that treated the disrupted sleep, the flat affect, the loss of energy as the disease, was missing the psyche's intentionality. The symptoms were messages. They were the psyche's way of communicating that something in the life structure needed to change. The analyst Igor Caruso, working in Vienna in the post-war decades, described mental illness as the individual's refusal, sometimes heroic, to adapt to conditions that should not be adapted to. The symptom in this reading is a protest, an insistence that the life being lived does not fit the life that should be lived. This is not a comfortable idea for clinical institutions to hold. Institutions need protocols. Protocols require stable categories. If every symptom is a message unique to this person's meaning-making, you cannot write a protocol for it. But for the individual in the office, the individual with the question beneath the question, the meaning-centered approach is often the one that reaches where the other approaches stop. The psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, who had arrived at his own version of meaning-centered psychology through the extremity of the Nazi concentration camps, through his years at Auschwitz and Theresienstadt, through the observation of who survived and what they shared, described what he called the existential vacuum. The sense of meaninglessness that he believed was the defining neurosis of the second half of the 20th century. Not repression, as Freud believed. Not inferiority, as Adler believed. Meaninglessness. Frankl's logotherapy was built to address this. Find the meaning, even in suffering, especially in suffering. Jung would have agreed with the diagnosis, though his treatment went deeper into the symbolic. The psyche did not only need meaning, it needed the particular kind of meaning that came from being in right relationship with the whole of what one was, the shadow as well as the persona, the unconscious as well as the ego, the archetype as well as the personal history. Mental health, in Jung's vision, was not the absence of darkness. It was the capacity to hold darkness and light together, without being overwhelmed by either, without splitting off one in favor of the other. This was what he called the transcendent function, the ability of the psyche to generate a third position between the ego's preferred position and the unconscious's opposing pressure. Not a compromise, a synthesis, something new that neither side alone could have produced. Health was not equilibrium, it was integration. The psychiatrist Stanislav Grof, working at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center in the 1960s and 1970s, with clinical uses of expanded states of consciousness, found patterns in his patients' experiences that paralleled exactly the transpersonal dimensions Jung had described. Patients in deep therapeutic work encountered not only personal material, childhood memories, relational wounds, but what Grof called perinatal and transpersonal material. Experiences that seemed to connect to biological processes around birth, to ancestral patterns, to something that felt like collective memory rather than personal history. Grof was a careful clinician. He did not leap to mystical explanation, but he concluded, over decades of work, that the psyche was demonstrably deeper than the personal, that the Jungian claim about the collective unconscious was not metaphorical, that people reliably accessed material that could not be accounted for by their individual histories. This was not something that fit comfortably in the clinical institutions of the late 20th century. Grof spent much of his career on the margins of psychiatry, not because his data was poor, but because his conclusions were too large for the existing framework to hold. The framework had decided what the mind was before it had finished looking. The vision of mental health that Jung proposed was one in which the framework was always being expanded, always provisional, always open to the evidence that the psyche was larger than the current model could accommodate. This openness was not weakness. It was the only honest epistemological position available to someone who had actually spent time in the deep places of the mind. The question Thomas could not quite form was the right question. His psyche was working on it, as yours is working tonight, beneath the layer where the thinking happens. Chapter 22. Consciousness is born from conflict. Jung made a historical claim that most of his colleagues in the early 20th century were not prepared to accept. He claimed that consciousness, not individual consciousness, but the general human capacity for self-awareness, had been won from the unconscious through conflict. That awareness was not a given, not a simple property of the nervous system, but something hard-earned, something that had required the development of an ego capable of standing apart from the surrounding psychic field and saying, I. This was not a comfortable idea for those who believed that consciousness was the natural endpoint of biological evolution, the crown of the developmental process. For them, consciousness was the destination. For Jung, consciousness was one outcome of a particular kind of struggle, and a relatively recent one and a fragile one. He found evidence for this view in the history of myth. The oldest mythologies, the Babylonian, the Egyptian, the earliest layers of Greek thought, did not describe consciousness in the terms the modern West takes for granted. They described a world not yet differentiated, a pre-personal cosmos where the line between self and world, between inner and outer, between the human and the divine, was permeable. The hero myths, Marduk slaying Tiamat, Perseus slaying Medusa, the countless variations of the dragon-slaying story were, in Jung's reading, mythic accounts of the emergence of consciousness from the undifferentiated unconscious. The dragon is the unconscious in its pre-personal, swallowing aspect. The hero who slays the dragon is the ego, establishing its separateness. And the victory is never permanent. The monster always threatens to return. Consciousness always risks dissolution back into the unconscious sea. The philosopher Erich Neumann, who studied with Jung in Zurich and then settled in Tel Aviv, wrote what remains perhaps the most comprehensive account of this process, The Origins and History of Consciousness. Published in 1949, Neumann traced the development of human self-awareness through the evolution of mythic symbolism, showing how the ego's increasing capacity to stand apart from the unconscious was reflected in the changing character of the myths cultures told about themselves. The infant, Neumann observed, lives in something close to the original undifferentiated state, bathed in sensory experience. Without clear boundary between inside and outside, the proto-self embedded in the proto-world. The process of psychological development is the gradual emergence of the ego from this state, the gradual establishment of an I capable of relating to the world rather than simply being swallowed by it. But this emergence comes at a cost. The cost is the loss of the original union. The price of consciousness is alienation, the sense of being separate, of standing apart, of being a self among other selves in a world that does not automatically provide meaning. This is why Jung believed the longing to return, to merge, to dissolve the boundaries, to recover the original wholeness is so persistent and so powerful. It is not pathological. It is the memory of where the ego came from. And this is why the spiritual traditions across cultures have always valued states of consciousness beyond the ordinary ego state: meditation, prayer, ritual, mystical experience. Not as escape from the ego's responsibilities, but as temporary return to the source from which the ego draws its life. The philosopher Jean Gebser, working in Switzerland in the 1940s and 1950s, and developing what he called a history of human consciousness, described the movement from magical to mythical to mental to integral consciousness as a series of mutations, not evolutionary gradations, but genuine structural shifts in how the human being experienced reality. Each mutation preserved something from the previous structure while adding a new capacity. Gebser was not a Jungian, but he was doing something similar, tracking the unfolding of consciousness as a real historical process, not as a simple progression from worse to better, but as a series of hard-won expansions. And each expansion, Gebser noted, was accompanied by crisis. The old structure resisted the new. The transition was painful. This maps precisely onto what Jung described at the individual level. The expansion of consciousness, the integration of shadow material, the encounter with the unconscious figures, the movement toward the self was never comfortable. It always required the ego to give up something it had been holding, to accept a correction, to expand its sense of what it was. Jung observed that the most significant expansions of individual consciousness came precisely at the points of greatest difficulty. The midlife crisis that was genuinely engaged with, not managed, not anesthetized, but entered and lived through, often produced a person more deeply themselves at the other end. The loss that was grieved rather than bypassed. The depression that was listened to rather than only medicated. The suffering was not necessary for its own sake, but it was the form in which the expansion was being offered. Consciousness is precious because it was won. It is narrow because winning required drawing a boundary. The boundary protects you, and the sea is still there on the other side of it, holding everything. Chapter 23. The Symbolic Life of Suffering. There is a particular cruelty in a suffering that makes no sense. Physical pain, at least, has a referent. It points to damage. It says, here, something is wrong in the body. The pain is still terrible, but it is located. Grief points to loss. Rage points to violation. These emotions have objects, and the objects make the emotions, however painful, somewhat interpretable. But there is a suffering without a clear cause, a heaviness that does not lift even when the circumstances improve, a hollow feeling after the achievement, a recurring ache that no diagnosis captures and no change of situation dissolves. Jung was drawn to this kind of suffering. He believed it carried meaning. He had observed, both in himself and in his patients, that the periods of deepest psychological suffering were often the periods of greatest psychic transformation, not despite the suffering, through it. The suffering was the material through which the psyche was working something out, and the suffering that was attended to, that was engaged with symbolically, that was asked what it carried, was suffering that could become something. The alchemists fascinated Jung for precisely this reason. He spent decades studying alchemical texts, not because he believed in the physical transformation of lead to gold, but because he believed the alchemists were describing in symbolic language a psychological process. The materia prima, the raw, chaotic, base material with which the alchemists began, was the shadow material, the unconscious content, the suffering and confusion that preceded transformation. The process of transmutation, the heating, the dissolving, the recombining, was, in Jung's reading, the process of individuation, the long, often painful work of bringing the unconscious contents into relationship with consciousness, of integrating what had been split off, of making what was lead into something that could carry the weight of a whole life. The theologian and scholar of religion Mircea Eliade, working in Chicago in the 1950s and 1960s, and in dialogue with Jung's ideas, wrote about initiation rites across cultures, the rites in which the initiant underwent a symbolic death and rebirth, a dismemberment and reconstitution, a descent into the underworld, and a return. These rites were not decorative, they were technologies of transformation. The community understood that growth required a passage through something that felt like dying. Modern secular culture had largely discarded these rites. It had discarded the symbolic containers for suffering, and without containers, suffering did not transform, it simply accumulated. It became what the clinicians measured and the medications addressed. Jung believed the symbolic life was the container, not that suffering could always be transformed, not that every loss had a compensating meaning, but that the engagement with suffering on the level of symbol and story and meaning, the asking of what this is asking, was the difference between suffering that exhausted and suffering that eventually deepened. The human moment that came to Jung most powerfully in this context was the figure of Job, the biblical figure who suffered everything, who argued with God, who refused the comfortable explanations his friends offered, who insisted that his suffering required an accounting. What Job was doing, Jung wrote in his late work Answer to Job, was holding the tension, not resolving it prematurely into either despair or consolation, holding the tension. That is the symbolic life of suffering. It is harder than resolution, and richer. Let your breath be what it is tonight. Chapter 24. Why the Psyche Corrects the Ego. A woman, call her Helena, had spent 30 years being the competent one. She had organized the family, she had managed the career, she had held everything together during the illnesses, the financial difficulties, the departures and arrivals. She was admired. She was depended upon, and she had built her identity so entirely around her competence that she no longer knew what she was without it. She came to analysis not in crisis, but in a slow erosion. The competence was still there. The admiration was still there. But something had stopped working. Some internal engine that had kept her going had quietly sputtered and gone quiet. And then the dreams began. Not the nightmares she might have expected, something stranger. She dreamed repeatedly of a girl, a child, perhaps 8 years old, sitting alone in a garden, doing nothing. Not sad, not waiting for anything, just sitting, playing with a leaf, watching a beetle move across a stone, present in a way Helena had not been in decades. The psyche was correcting. This is the compensatory function that Jung believed was the unconscious's primary purpose in relation to the conscious mind. The ego develops a one-sidedness over time. It adapts to the demands of life by developing certain functions and suppressing others. The person who lives by competence neglects the capacity for aimlessness, for play, for the non-instrumental enjoyment of existing. The person who lives by emotion neglects the capacity for structure, for clarity, for the kind of thinking that cuts rather than feels. The unconscious notices the imbalance, and it sends corrections. The corrections come in dreams, in bodily symptoms, in sudden, inexplicable losses of motivation in the direction the ego has been going too hard. The correction is not punishment. It is the system seeking balance. The biologist Walter Cannon, working at Harvard in the early 20th century, developed the concept of homeostasis, the body's tendency to maintain stable internal conditions through regulatory feedback mechanisms. Temperature, blood chemistry, hormone levels. The body was always working to correct deviations from its functional range. Jung believed the psyche operated by an analogous principle, not homeostasis of mood. The psyche was not trying to keep you comfortable, but homeostasis of wholeness. The psyche was trying to keep the full range of what you were in some kind of working balance, and when the ego's adaptation strayed too far from that balance, the unconscious pushed back. The ego's preferred response to this pushback is to ignore it, or to pathologize it, or to manage it more efficiently. The ego does not easily accept correction. It is in the nature of the ego to believe that its current position is the right position. The work Jung called Individuation required something different: the ego's willingness to be corrected, to receive the dream's compensation, to take seriously the symptom's message, to allow the child in the garden to have her moment in the sun. Helena, over the following year, began leaving some things unmanaged. She began, with enormous difficulty, to sit still sometimes without having an agenda for the sitting. She began to let the child in the garden exist. The competence did not disappear, but it stopped being everything. Something else had room now. That room is available to you too. Tonight, nothing is required of you, not even the effort of sleep. Chapter 25, Overthinking Above Deeper Wisdom. You are halfway through tonight. 25 chapters, and somewhere along the way, perhaps you have drifted. Perhaps certain ideas have caught on something, a small snag of recognition, and then released. Perhaps you have already begun to move towards sleep. All of that is right. All of that is what this is for. But if you are still here, still listening, there is something in this chapter that I want to say carefully, because it concerns the thing you are most likely doing right now. Overthinking, not as a failure, as a habit. A deeply ingrained, often very useful habit that has been applied, at least tonight, to a problem it cannot solve. Jung was interested in what he called the thinking type, one of the psychological types he described in his 1921 book, Psychological Types, a typology that would eventually become the basis for the Myers-Briggs type indicator and 100 other personality frameworks. The thinking type processed the world primarily through analysis, through logic, through systematic examination of evidence. This is a genuine gift. The world needs thinking types. They build systems, identify errors, resist the seductions of easy emotion. But the thinking type, Jung observed, often has a specific blind spot: the tendency to believe that any problem can be solved by more thinking. That if the analysis is not working, the solution is more analysis. That if the conclusion is not arriving, the solution is more premises. And this is where the deeper wisdom is systematically bypassed. The philosopher and mathematician Henri Poincaré, describing his own creative process in Science and Method, published in 1908, wrote about the experience of insight that arrived not during concentrated effort, but after effort had been abandoned. He had been working on a mathematical problem for weeks without progress. He stepped away. He went on a geological excursion, and at the moment of boarding an omnibus at Coutances, the solution arrived fully formed, without any conscious effort at all. Poincaré was not a Jungian. He was describing the phenomenology of creativity from inside his own experience. But what he described was exactly the pattern Jung would have predicted. The conscious mind reaches its limit, it releases, and the solution comes from below the limit. The deeper wisdom is not slower, it is differently paced. It processes in parallel, not in sequence. It holds more variables than the rational mind can track. And it delivers not through effort, but through the willingness to stop efforting. The Taoist tradition, which Jung engaged with through his collaboration with the scholar Richard Wilhelm in the 1920s, described this as Wu Wei, effortless action, not passivity. Not withdrawal, but a particular kind of active receptivity, a moving with rather than against, a trust that the river will carry you if you stop fighting the current. The problem you have been turning over tonight, the question you cannot resolve, the situation you cannot see your way through, that problem is being worked on right now. Not by the thinking you are doing, by something below the thinking. The best thing the thinking can do at this hour is rest. Let your mind settle like sediment in still water. What is clear will be clear in the morning. Chapter 26. When logic cannot heal. There is a specific disappointment that comes from discovering that you already know what you need to know. You have read the books, you have had the conversations, you have sat in offices across from competent and caring professionals and arrived at entirely accurate diagnoses of what has happened to you and why. You can name the patterns, you can trace the origins. You understand, with the clarity of someone who has done the intellectual work, exactly how your childhood shaped your defenses, exactly how your losses produced your habits, exactly what it would mean to live differently. And yet, the knowing and the changing are not the same thing. Jung encountered this in the clinic constantly. Patients who had perfect intellectual insight into their dynamics, who could explain their neurosis with clinical precision, and who continued, nonetheless, to live exactly as they had lived before. The insight had reached the ego. It had not reached the place where change actually happens. He called this the difference between a merely intellectual realization and an experience. An insight was cheap, an experience was dear. The experience was what changed something. The psychologist Irvin Yalom, working out of Stanford University in the 1970s and 1980s and developing what he called existential psychotherapy, described the same phenomenon in his clinical accounts. He found that patients needed what he called corrective emotional experiences, not just new understandings, but new relational encounters, new felt realities that updated the emotional operating system rather than merely adding data to the cognitive one. Logic could provide the map. It could not traverse the terrain. The terrain was emotional. It was symbolic. It was held in the body and in the relational field, in the quality of how two people sat together in a room and what moved between them. This was something that could not be planned or designed. It happened or it did not. And when it happened, the patient often wept, not from sadness exactly, but from the strange relief of being seen in a place they had protected for decades. The philosopher Michael Polanyi writing in the 1950s and 1960s about what he called tacit knowledge, argued that most human knowing was not propositional, not of the form X is true, but embodied, practical, a kind of skill that was held in the doing rather than in the knowing about. You cannot learn to ride a bicycle from a description of the relevant physics. The knowing is in the body. Healing, Jung believed, was like this. It required a kind of knowing that went below language, below logic, into the body's held memory and the psyche's symbolic life. This is why he used active imagination, a technique he developed in which the patient would enter a semi-conscious state and engage dialogically with the figures arising from the unconscious. Not analyzing the figures, talking with them, being surprised by them, allowing them to say what the conscious mind did not already know. This is why dreams mattered to him beyond their interpretable content, because the experience of the dream, the feeling tone of it, the bodily residue it left, was itself the work. Not what the dream meant, but what the dream did. What cannot be said can sometimes be felt. The philosopher and psychoanalytic theorist Julia Kristeva, writing in Paris in the 1980s, described what she called the semiotic, a pre-linguistic layer of expression that preceded and underlaid the symbolic, the realm of articulate language and social meaning. The semiotic was rhythmic, tonal, embodied. It was where the infant communicated before words, where music moved before it meant anything, where the body spoke its particular truth before the mind could find the sentence. Christopher was describing, in another vocabulary, the layer that Jung's clinical work had been engaging with for decades. The layer that logic could not penetrate. The layer where healing actually happened when it did happen. The clinical literature on trauma makes this particularly concrete. Judith Herman. In her 1992 book, Trauma and Recovery, one of the most important clinical texts of the late 20th century, described the treatment of traumatic experience as requiring work on 3 levels: the stabilization of safety, the processing of traumatic memories, and the reconnection with ordinary life. And the middle stage, the processing, could not be done through talk alone. It required moving through the body, through the felt sense of the traumatic material, through what the body had been holding since the original event. What Herman described in clinical terms confirmed what Jung had observed in the consulting room in Kusnacht. The level at which the wound was held was not the level of propositions. Logic could explain the wound. It could not touch it. Touch required something else. Tonight, whatever is in your body right now, whatever residue of the day, whatever weight that has no name, it does not require a solution, only acknowledgement. You are here, it is here, that is enough. Chapter 27, The Self Beyond Awareness. There is a distinction in Jung that takes time to arrive at, because it cuts against the way most of us have been taught to think about identity. When Jung spoke of the ego, he meant the center of consciousness, the I that thinks and decides and narrates the life. But when he spoke of the self, with a capital S. He meant something far larger. The totality of the psyche. Consciousness and unconscious, both. The ego plus everything the ego cannot see. The self, in Jung's framework, is not a thing you become aware of. It is the context within which awareness happens. The ego is to the self what the candle is to the room. The candle cannot illuminate the room, but the room contains the candle. The room is the larger truth. And the self, Jung believed, was not merely a theoretical concept. It was an experiential reality. People touched it in moments of great stillness, great suffering, great beauty. In the moment on the mountain when the body goes quiet and something larger than personal history is present. In the moment beside the bed of someone dying, when time becomes different and the air thickens with something that has no name in ordinary language. The mystics across traditions had described this. Meister Eckhart, the 14th century German Dominican theologian, wrote of what he called the ground of the soul, a depth in the human being that was identical with the divine ground, that was always already one with the ultimate reality, regardless of what the surface of the person's life looked like. Eckhart was describing it in theological terms. Jung recognized the psychological structure, a deeper center than the ego, a center that was organized and purposive and oriented toward wholeness. He found the same structure in Eastern thought, the Atman in Hindu philosophy, the individual self that is ultimately identical with the Brahman, the universal self. The Buddha nature in Mahayana Buddhism, the innate capacity for awakening that is always already present, not something to be achieved, but something to be uncovered. Jung did not collapse these traditions into his psychology. He used them as triangulating witnesses, different cultural expressions pointing at the same underlying reality. The self was what individuation was moving toward, not a final state, not a destination where everything was resolved and the process was complete, but an ongoing orientation, a life more and more aligned with the larger pattern of what one actually was, rather than with the ego's preferences for what it would like to be. The analyst Edward Edinger, who spent his career applying Jung's concepts with careful precision, described the ego-self axis as the essential dynamic of psychological life. Too much ego autonomy, the ego believing itself entirely self-sufficient, produced the inflation that led to grandiosity, rigidity, the refusal to learn. Too much ego dissolution, the ego overwhelmed by the unconscious, produced the flooding that looked like psychosis. The healthy relationship was a living connection, the ego rooted in the self having a representative in consciousness through which it could act in the world. You are more than you know, not in an empty, reassuring way, in a structural way. The part of you that knows, the thinking, deciding, narrating part, is a part. There is a whole that contains it. That whole is what you rest in tonight. It has been holding you all along. Chapter 28. Emotional Healing Through Meaning. Viktor Frankl, standing in Auschwitz in 1944, made an observation that would shape the rest of his working life. He noticed that survival in the camps seemed to be correlated with meaning. Not with physical strength alone, not with age or health status alone, but with something that the prisoners who survived tended to have and those who did not tended to lack: a reason. Something outside themselves, a person, a task, a vision of something they would do after, that organized their will and their endurance. He was not the only observer. Bruno Bettelheim, another psychoanalytically trained clinician who survived the camps and wrote about the experience, made similar observations. What the most degraded conditions revealed was that the inner life was not a luxury. It was, in the most literal possible sense, a survival mechanism. Frankl developed logotherapy around this insight. The Greek logos means meaning. His therapy was oriented not toward symptom relief as a primary goal, but toward meaning restoration. Find what gives your life its weight, reconnect with it. And from that reconnection, suffering that cannot be removed can be borne. Jung would have recognized this immediately, though his path to the same insight was longer and more theoretical. He had arrived at the centrality of meaning not through extremity, but through decades of clinical work with people who had everything the culture said they should need: security, status, comfortable lives, and who nonetheless arrived at his office in Kusnacht, Switzerland, with the peculiar emptiness of a life that was functioning and yet did not feel like a life. He had written, "The least of things with a meaning is worth more in life than the greatest of things without it." Meaning, for Jung, was not something you chose or constructed, it was something you discovered. It was already in the material of your life, in the pattern of what you had lived, but the pattern required a certain quality of attention to become visible. The analyst and author Thomas More, drawing on Jung and James Hillman, wrote in Care of the Soul, published in 1992, about the distinction between cure and care. Cure sought the elimination of the problem. Care sought a deepened relationship with it. Cure wanted the symptom gone. Care wanted to understand what the symptom was carrying and to attend to it with something like respect. Emotional healing in this framework does not mean the return to a state of emotional painlessness. It means the recovery of a relationship with one's emotional life, including the painful parts, that is characterized by understanding rather than avoidance. It means recognizing that the grief, the longing, the fear, the love, these are not malfunctions. They are the soul's language. They are pointing at what matters. Healing through meaning is not about making sense of suffering in some cosmic way. It is about refusing to let suffering be merely senseless, about engaging with it rather than enduring it, about asking what it is asking. The question is not, why did this happen to me? The question is, what is this asking me to become? Let that question rest in you gently. It does not require an answer tonight. Chapter 29. Why the Soul Uses Myth. Long before there were textbooks, before there were clinical offices, before there was a vocabulary for the inner life, there were stories. Stories told around fires, stories passed from grandparent to grandchild in the dark before sleep. Stories that were not meant to be understood intellectually, but absorbed bodily in the listening in the way certain images landed in the chest and stayed there. Jung believed that myth was not primitive science, a pre-rational attempt to explain the natural world that modern science had rendered obsolete. Myth was, and remained, the primary language of the soul, not because the soul was irrational, because the soul required a container larger than reason alone could build. The mythologist Joseph Campbell, who had read Jung deeply and built his own career on the structural patterns of myth across cultures, described what he called the monomyth, the hero's journey, the single underlying structure that appears in the stories of cultures on every inhabited continent. The hero departs from the known world. The hero crosses a threshold into the unknown. The hero undergoes trials, meets helpers and enemies, descends into something like death. The hero returns, transformed, carrying something of value for the community. Campbell was describing in mythological terms exactly the process Jung called individuation, the departure from the ego's familiar territory. The encounter with the unconscious contents, the shadow, the anima or animus, the archetype of the self, the transformation that came through that encounter, the return to ordinary life, carrying something that had been found in the depth. This is not metaphor for something else. The myth is describing the actual shape of psychological development. The soul uses myth because myth has room for the whole of what a life contains. Room for the descent, not just the ascent. Room for failure, not just achievement. Room for the encounter with what is frightening and what is sacred. Myth does not say, "Here is how to manage your symptoms." It says, "Here is the shape of the difficulty you are in. Here is the shape of the one who went before you. Here is what they found." The scholar Karen Armstrong, who has spent a career studying the history of religious thought, distinguishes between mythos and logos as two modes of discourse that ancient cultures treated as complementary and that modernity has collapsed into a hierarchy with logos on top. Logos is analytical, sequential, aimed at practical truth. Mythos is narrative, symbolic, aimed at meaning. Both are necessary. The modern era, Armstrong argues, is to demand that mythos perform the functions of logos, to ask whether the creation story is scientifically accurate, whether the flood happened historically, which misses the point entirely. The creation story is not claiming to be geology. It is describing something about the experience of existence, of emerging from chaos into form, of the terrifying and generative nature of beginnings. Jung read myth, the way Armstrong describes, as a map of the psyche. Not the individual psyche alone, but the psyche's deepest patterns, the patterns that are older than any individual life, and that every life will, in one form or another, enact. You have been living a myth, not consciously, but the shape of your life, the departures and returns, the losses and discoveries, the encounters with what you could not handle and what you ultimately could. This has a shape that myth has described. The scholar Robert Siegel, who has spent a career analyzing the relationship between mythology and psychology, notes that what distinguished Jung's use of myth from purely literary or anthropological approaches was his insistence on the myth's psychological efficacy. A myth was not merely interesting, it was functional. It did something in the psyche of the person who engaged with it genuinely. This is what the church understood in its best moments, what the shaman understood, what the storyteller understood before storytelling became entertainment. The story that speaks to the soul speaks because it is organized around an archetypal pattern, around one of those deep structures in the psyche that predates any individual life, and that every individual life will, in some form, enact. The hero's descent is not just an interesting narrative structure. It is a description of what happens when a human being stops pretending and faces what they have been avoiding. The recognition, the moment when the listener hears a story and feels in the body that it is about them, this is the archetype activating. The pattern in the story meeting the pattern in the psyche. The outside touching the inside through the medium of image. This is why great literature does something that clinical explanation does not. The novel that helps you understand something about grief does not explain grief. It creates a space inside which your own grief can become visible to you. The story is the container. The container makes the recognition possible. Jung read myths and fairy tales and literature with this in mind. Not what did the author intend, what did the psyche do with the material? What archetypal pattern was being enacted? What the story knew about the human condition that no propositional account could fully capture. The story is not finished, and the soul is the part of you that knows it. Chapter 30. The Strange Intelligence of Dreams. A man in his early 40s, call him Richard, was preparing to leave a job he had held for 15 years. Not fired, not fleeing. He had built something real. He was leaving by choice, towards something that felt both necessary and terrifying. He had thought about it carefully, rationally, with spreadsheets and conversations and long hours of deliberation. He had concluded, this is right. And then, the night before he submitted his resignation, he dreamed. He was in an enormous library. He walked through it for what felt like hours. The library kept expanding, new rooms opening off old rooms, collections of books in languages he could not read, maps of territories he did not recognize. He was not lost, exactly. He was searching, and at the very end of the last room he found a small, ordinary window. Outside, a garden he recognized immediately as his grandmother's garden, exactly as it had been when he was 7. He woke with the feeling that the dream had said yes, not to the job change, though it had done that too, but yes to the longer movement. Yes to the part of him that had been the boy in his grandmother's garden, the part that knew things before the career, before the 15 years of impressive achievement, before the spreadsheets. Yes to the part that needed more room to look around. He submitted the resignation. This is what Jung meant by the strange intelligence of dreams. Not strange because it was supernatural. Strange because it was organizing information and arriving at conclusions through processes the waking mind could not replicate. The dream had synthesized 15 years of embodied knowledge, the specific quality of how he sat at his desk on difficult days, the recurring tightness in his shoulders during certain meetings, the particular aliveness that appeared in conversations about the new direction, and it had delivered the synthesis as a felt image, not as an argument, as an experience. The neuroscientist Matthew Walker, whose work on sleep research at the University of California, Berkeley, has made the function of dreaming a more mainstream scientific conversation, describes REM sleep as a period of intense neurological activity in which the brain is doing what he calls emotional first aid, processing the emotional residue of recent experience, finding connections between new material and stored memory, doing something that the waking brain's architecture makes harder: associative integration across widely separated domains. What Walker describes in neural terms, Jung described in psychological ones. The dreaming mind is not resting, it is working. And it is working on the problems the waking mind has identified but cannot resolve by conscious effort. The strange intelligence of dreams is the intelligence of pattern recognition at a scale the ego cannot manage, of integration that requires a different operating state, of meaning-making that happens below the level of language. The researcher Deirdre Barrett at Harvard Medical School has spent years collecting and analyzing the content of dreams, particularly in relation to problem solving. What she found confirmed Poincare's anecdote with something closer to systematic evidence. People can and do use dreams to work through both intellectual and emotional problems, not by consciously directing the dream, by presenting the problem to the sleeping mind and then paying attention to what comes back. Barrett called this the committee of sleep. The sleeping brain is not one thing. It is many things operating in parallel, with reduced interference from the prefrontal inhibition that, awake, keeps so many associative connections from forming. In sleep, connections can be made across enormous distances, between a present problem and a 20-year-old memory, between a feeling in the body and a structural pattern in the situation, between what is known and what has not yet been consciously identified. This is not mystical. It is the neural architecture of the sleeping brain, temporarily freed from the constraints of waking cognition, doing what it does best. And what Jung was describing in clinical terms, the autonomous message, the compensatory function, the intention of the unconscious. This is what the sleeping brain's unconstrained associative activity looks like from the inside. The image that arrives feels intentional because, in a sense, it is. Not intentional in the way a plan is intentional, but organized, directed toward something, carrying information that the waking mind, in its more constrained state, could not generate. You do not have to do anything with your dreams. You do not have to remember them. You do not have to analyze them. But if an image rises tonight, if something comes that feels significant, without being interpretable, receive it. It has arrived from the part of you that sees more than you know. If your mind has drifted, come back gently. We are still here. The ideas will keep. You have nothing to hold on to. Just listen. Chapter 31. Loneliness in the rational age. There is a particular form of loneliness that is almost invisible because it does not look like loneliness. It looks like busyness. It looks like productivity. It looks like the full calendar and the full inbox and the full life that nonetheless feels somewhere inside strangely empty. Not lonely in the way of isolation. There are people around. Lonely in a way that people cannot reach. Jung believed this was one of the defining conditions of modern Western life. He called it, in various formulations across his writing, the loss of the symbolic life. The condition of living without engagement with the deeper layers of meaning that myth, ritual, dream, and community had once provided. He wrote about this most directly in a 1939 lecture titled The Spiritual Problem of Modern Man, though he had been circling the topic since the 1920s. Modern man, Jung argued, had traded the symbolic life for the rational life, had traded engagement with the unconscious for mastery over the external world, and the trade had produced enormous material gains. But it had left the soul untenanted. The sociologist Robert Bellah, working at Berkeley in the 1980s and drawing on observations about American culture that applied with equal force across the industrialized West, described in Habits of the Heart what he called the radical individualism that had become the dominant ethos. Each person responsible for their own meaning, each person the author of their own life story. And the logical consequence, each person essentially alone in the construction of that story, without the communal resources that had once provided a shared symbolic vocabulary. Bellah was not a Jungian, but he was describing, from a sociological direction, exactly what Jung had described from the psychological one. The loneliness of a consciousness that has been stripped of its connections to the deeper layers of what makes a human life feel like more than a series of transactions. The philosopher Charles Taylor, in his 1991 book, The Ethics of Authenticity, described the modern individual as burdened by the demand to be authentic, to discover and express their own unique identity without any robust shared framework within which authenticity could be defined, recognized. The demand is impossible. You cannot generate meaning in total isolation. Meaning requires a context. The self requires a community of reference. Jung's prescription was not to return to pre-modern religion, though he respected the symbolic resources of religion. His prescription was to attend to the symbolic material that was still being generated in dreams, in the images arising from the unconscious, in the experiences of beauty and awe and depth that every modern person had and tended to dismiss as merely subjective. The loneliness of the rational age is, at root, the loneliness of a consciousness that has lost contact with what is below and around it, with the sea beneath the island, with the collective layer that connects each individual to every other, and to the long history of what it has meant to be human. That connection is not gone. It is waiting for attention. You are not as alone as the surface of the rational mind sometimes feels. Let your breath move you back toward whatever warmth is present in your body. it is there. Chapter 32. The Fear of Irrational Truth. We are near the end now. Something to notice as we arrive in these final chapters. The voice has been the same throughout. Steady, unhurried. The ideas have been meeting the body as it settles towards sleep. And whatever has been thought about, turned over, half-grasped, all of that is already doing its quiet work. Jung was afraid of one thing above most others. Not afraid in the way of terror, afraid in the way of sustained caution, the way a man who has spent time near a cliff face respects the edge without refusing to approach it. What he was afraid of was the loss of reason in the service of the irrational. The psychic inflation that mistook the voice of the unconscious for the voice of God or truth or destiny, and that acted on that voice without the mediating function of consciousness. He had seen it happen. He had seen it happen in his patients, the manic break, the mystical inflation, the moment when the unconscious flooded the ego and the distinction between inner reality and outer reality dissolved. He had seen it happen in history. He lived through 2 world wars, through the rise of National Socialism in Germany, and he wrote extensively about what he saw as the collective possession of a culture that had abandoned rational consciousness for the irrationalism of myth and archetype, activated by a demagogue who knew how to speak the language of the unconscious directly to the suppressed contents of a people's shadow. The fear of irrational truth was therefore not a fear that the truth was irrational. It was a fear that the irrational, when it broke loose from the container of consciousness, could overwhelm the structures that made civilized life possible. But there was also within this fear a subtler thing, a recognition that the irrational truth, the truth held in symbols, in dreams, in the body's knowing, was genuinely true, that it had to be received, and that the refusal to receive it, the hardening of consciousness against the unconscious material, was its own form of danger. The psychologist Rollo May, again, he appears here because his synthesis of existential and depth psychology was perhaps the most careful attempt in the 20th century to hold both sides. Described the creative encounter as the meeting of the ordered and the disordered. The artist who produced something genuinely new was the one who could tolerate the anxiety of contact with the irrational, who could hold open the channel long enough for something genuinely other to come through, and who then brought the craft of conscious attention to shaping what had arrived. This is the courage Jung was asking for. Not the courage to be irrational, the courage to receive the irrational material, the dream, the image, the feeling that comes without a rational cause, and to hold it consciously, to let it speak, to take it seriously, to allow it to change something. The fear of irrational truth is the fear of one's own depth, and the depth is not the enemy. It is the source. Chapter 33, Consciousness and the Unlived Life. At the age of 57, Rainer Maria Rilke, the Austrian poet whose Letters to a Young Poet has been read by every serious reader of the interior life for more than a century, wrote to a friend that he was afraid not of death, of the life he had not lived, of the rooms he had not entered, of the experiences he had avoided, in the service of the work, and that now seemed to press upon him with a weight they had not had before. He died the following year, in 1926. Whether he found his way into those rooms is not recorded. The unlived life. Jung believed that this was perhaps the most pressing psychological concern of the second half of life. Not the wounds of childhood, though those mattered. Not the failures of ambition, though those had consequences. The unlived life, the capacities, the loves, the expressions of self that had been set aside in favor of what was practical, safe, expected, pressed back from the unconscious with increasing force as the years accumulated. He described this with particular attention in essays on what he called the second half of life, a period he roughly located from the late 30s onward, when the tasks of the first half, establishing identity, building a career, forming relationships, taking a place in the social world, had been largely accomplished, and when the psyche turned its attention to questions the first half did not need to ask. What is this life ultimately for? What have I been avoiding? What would I be if I were not what I have made myself to be? The existential psychiatrist Irvin Yalom, in his book of case studies, Staring at the Sun, published in 2008, when Yalom was in his late 70s and writing with the authority of age, described how death anxiety intensified in patients who felt they had not lived their lives, not the people who had suffered most. The people who had played it safest, who had made the cautious choice at every junction, who arrived at mortality's edge with the specific regret of the road not taken. The unlived life does not disappear because it is not lived. It persists in the unconscious. It generates pressure. It surfaces in the dreams of the successful person who feels inexplicably hollow. In the recurring sense that the life being lived is somehow beside the real one, in the depression that arrives not from loss, but from abundance, from having all the things that were supposed to be enough and discovering they are not. Jung's answer was not to abandon what had been built and start over. He was too psychologically realistic for that. The answer was to begin now attending to what had been set aside. Not wholesale revolution, a corner turned, an experiment taken, a capacity allowed back into the room. The philosopher Simone de Beauvoir, writing in The Ethics of Ambiguity in 1947, argued that the freedom to become something was not a gift but a responsibility, and that the refusal of freedom, the choosing of determined safety over genuine self-determination, was itself a kind of ethical failure. She was not speaking of career choices. She was speaking of the fundamental freedom to be genuinely one's self. The unlived life is not gone. It is here, tonight, in the gap between who you are and who you have not yet allowed yourself to be. Not accusing, not demanding, waiting with something that resembles patience. It has time, and so, still, do you. Chapter 34, Individuation against Reductionism. Jung used the word individuation for the process he cared about most. It is easy to misread. Individuation does not mean individualism. It does not mean becoming self-sufficient or withdrawing from community or following your own light regardless of consequence. The word comes from the Latin individuum, something that cannot be divided without losing what it is. Jung's individuation was about becoming undivided, about becoming whole, which required, paradoxically, the integration of what had been divided off, the shadow, the unlived life, the functions the ego had suppressed in favor of its preferred mode, the unconscious contents that had been running the show from below. The reductionist position, the position that Jung spent his career resisting, was that the human being was adequately described by the mechanisms of biology and the conditioning of environment. That consciousness was an epiphenomenon of neural events. That meaning was a feeling, and feelings were chemistry, and chemistry was physics, and physics was, in principle, complete. This position produces useful science. It does not produce a livable life. The philosopher Thomas Nagel, in his 1974 paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat?, one of the most influential papers in 20th century philosophy of mind, made an argument that the reductionist position could not accommodate. Even if you knew everything there was to know about a bat's neural architecture and echolocation system, you would still not know what it was like to be a bat. The subjective experience, the interiority, the felt quality of being inside a consciousness was not captured by any functional description. Nagel was arguing for the irreducibility of consciousness. Jung was arguing for something larger, not just the irreducibility of consciousness, but the irreducibility of the psyche. The full psyche, including its unconscious dimensions, its symbolic life, its capacity for meaning and transcendence, and the kind of experience that had no name in the reductionist vocabulary. Individuation against reductionism was not a battle fought in academic journals. It was fought in the lives of the patients who came to Jung's office in Küsnacht. The woman who had been told her dissatisfaction was hormonal. The man whose grief had been diagnosed as pathological. The young person whose vivid dream life had been labeled anxiety. The people who had been told, in effect, that what they were experiencing was a malfunction rather than a communication. Jung took them seriously. He took the communication seriously. And in taking it seriously, in engaging with the symbolic material as if it meant something, as if the psyche was doing something purposive, as if there was a pattern beneath the chaos, he helped people find their way toward a life that felt more like the life they were actually meant to live. The writer and philosopher Albert Camus, who was not a psychologist, but who understood the inner life with a novelist's precision, described in The First Man, his unfinished autobiographical novel found in the wreckage of the car crash that killed him in 1960, the specific texture of a life that was not yet fully his own. A life lived partly in response to what others needed, partly in performance for an imagined audience, only partly from the center that was genuinely his. The book was incomplete, but the movement toward that center was visible in every page. This is not a failure unique to Camus. It is the ordinary condition of a human life lived in society. The fully individuated life, the life lived entirely from the center of what one actually is an ideal, not an achievement. But the movement toward it is real, and the movement changes things. This is what it means to individuate. Not to become better at what you already are, to become more of what you have not yet allowed. The process never finishes. The circle closes further, but it is never fully closed. The integration deepens, but there is always more to integrate. But the direction is real, and the direction is yours. Chapter 35. Resting beneath the thinking mind. The thinking has been going on for a long time tonight. Not this, not the listening to these ideas, though that too, but the deeper thinking, the background processing, the thing the mind does even when you tell it to stop. The engine that keeps running after the ignition is turned off. Jung's psychology gives you permission to rest from that. Not by demanding that the mind go quiet, it will not when demanded, but by recognizing that the mind that thinks, the ego that plans and worries and rehearses, is not the whole, and what is below it does not need the same kind of effort. Below the thinking mind, something steadier runs. The body knows this. The body has always known this. The body knows how to breathe without instruction, how to heal without a plan, how to drift into sleep without consciously deciding to. The body's intelligence is not inferior to the mind's intelligence. It is differently organized. It operates in a register. The thinking mind cannot access by force. What sleep research has shown through the work of scientists like Arne Dietrich at the American University of Beirut and Matthew Walker at Berkeley is that the sleeping brain is not a brain at rest. It is a brain in a different mode of operation. A mode characterized by reduced prefrontal activity, the cognitive control network, the planning, the self-monitoring, and increased activity in the associative and emotional networks. The brain in sleep is doing something the awake brain cannot do. Not despite the loosening of conscious control. Because of it, the deeper wisdom requires the thinking mind to step back. This is not the thinking mind's failure, it is the condition. Jung described a moment in his own life, years after the Red Book, after the break with Freud, after the dark years of the visions, when he had achieved a kind of equilibrium. Not the resolution of all tensions, not the integration of all the unconscious material, that was never complete, but a relationship with the whole of his inner life that allowed him to function, to create, to relate with something he described as rootedness. He had a tower built at Bollingen on the shore of Lake Zurich in 1923. A simple stone structure without electricity, without the modern conveniences of his Kusnacht house. He went there regularly for the rest of his life to be without the noise, to carve stone, to cook on an open fire, to sit by the lake in a way that the professional life in the city did not allow. At Bollingen, he said, he felt most fully himself, not the accomplished psychiatrist, not the famous theorist himself. The person who had existed before the career and that the career had been built around. That self, the one beneath the thinking, beneath the professional identity, beneath the daily performance of functioning, that self is present in you tonight. It has been here all along. It is the part that breathes. Let your body grow heavy where it rests. Let the thinking do whatever it needs to do somewhere in the background. You do not have to attend to it. You can rest. Chapter 36, Sleep Inside the Larger Psyche. We began tonight in a late and quiet house. You were still. Something was still moving. The mind, the thought, the unnamed weight of the day. And we brought into that quiet a question. What is the mind when you include everything the mind contains? We walked through rooms. The candle of consciousness in the large dark room. The island above the sea. The ego standing in the much larger house of the psyche. Proud and necessary and limited. The shadow waiting in the unlit corner. The archetype older than any individual memory. The collective layer connecting you to everything that has ever been human. Jung spent his life walking through these rooms. Not because he wanted to lose himself in the dark, because he understood that the candle was only useful if you knew how large the room was. Because the island is only safe when the person living on it understands it is not the whole world. He sat in his tower at Bollingen by the lake in his 80s and wrote in his autobiography memories, dreams, reflections, which he completed with his colleague Agnella Jaffe in 1961, the year of his death. That he had spent his life seeking to understand the human psyche, and that the longer he looked, the larger it became. That there was always more. That the great mistake was to believe you had arrived at the bottom. There is no bottom. There is only depth, and the willingness to move in its direction. What does that mean for tonight? It means this. The thinking you have not been able to complete is not a failure. The question you have not been able to answer is not a defeat. The feeling you cannot name is not a malfunction. They are the signs of a psyche that is alive, that is larger than the ego that is trying to manage it. That has its own schedule, its own depths, its own movement towards something the ego has not yet understood. And sleep is not the suspension of that movement. Sleep is where the larger work happens, the work below words, the work below the thinking mind. The work of integration and compensation and dream sending that the unconscious has been waiting for the conscious mind to get out of the way so it can do. You are not stopping when you sleep. You are handing the project to a larger intelligence. The house that is mostly dark is not empty. It is full of what you have not yet seen and what you do not need to see tonight in order for it to serve you. Tonight, the candle dims. The room holds everything. The sea is quiet. The island rests on it. And somewhere below the level where the thinking stops, the deeper mind is awake, tending to what you could not reach, carrying what you could not hold, being the whole of what you are. Sleep now.